Greetings, traveler of time. Imagine, just for a moment, that the quiet of your night meets the heavy chill of a twilight in the 13th century, around the year 1285, over a lonely European valley carved into the mountains that watch the coast of Norway. I'm nothing more than an old historian, ready to whisper forgotten stories. If sleep finds you along the way, I'll be content. But tell me, from which corner of the world have you reached me, and what time is it where you are? While you're here, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel. The air here carries the salty, mineral scent of the fjord winding miles away, mixed with the sharp aroma of pine smoke rising from the few dark wooden huts scattered across the village of Velven, nestled beneath snow-capped peaks that stand like silent guardians. You can feel the damp cold slipping through any layer of clothing. This is a place where sunlight is a fleeting memory in winter, and the wind's whispers carry stories from forgotten ages, inviting quiet reflection, and perhaps a deeper, warmer sleep. Inside the abbey of St. Olaf of Fjorden, its grey stones barely distinguishable from the steep cliff they cling to, young brother Alban was bent over an oak writing desk, lit only by the soft yellow glow of a whale oil lamp that crackled faintly. The scriptorium's biting cold was held at bay only by his fierce concentration and the heavy wool cloak wrapped around him. He could feel the roughness of the parchment under his fingers as he copied, with a goldsmith's precision, the homilies of St. Gregory. The slightly metallic sweet scent of iron gall ink filled the small room, creating a little pocket of time within time. Alban, at 21, was the abbey's most talented and quickest scribe, yet his mind wasn't entirely on theology. A subtle restlessness, born from the village's recent rumours, mixed with the rhythmic cadence of his quill gliding across stretched skin. The scrolls he copied were treasures of knowledge and faith, and the act of copying itself was a devotion, a way of preserving wisdom for future generations in an age where reading was a privilege of the few. Yet what stole his peace tonight was the knowledge that in the rooms nearby lay older and less read volumes, the abbey's own records, chronicling local events and notes made by monks who'd lived within these same walls centuries before. He could almost feel the weight of history pressing on those shelves, a thick layer of silence and dust guarding the key to the strange events that were once again unsettling the people of Helvelven with eerie regularity, as if the valley had a memory of its own and refused to let the past rest. Alban had grown up hearing the whispered tales told around the abbey hearth, stories of blue lights dancing over the marsh and livestock vanishing without a trace. But now, those folk tales seemed to be stepping back into the present, unchanged. What troubled him most was how precisely the new events mirrored the old, like a visual and sensory echo. The coarse feel of his wool habit and the fading warmth of the lamp were his only tangible anchors as his thoughts drifted more and more toward the forbidden library. The Benedictine rule of ora et labora shaped his life, yet the need to understand, even if the truth was worldly, called to his soul, a prayer of a different kind, seeking light in the valley's ancient darkness. In Velven, the healer Ingrid felt this repetition of mysteries with a sensitivity that went far beyond ordinary fear. She wasn't learned like Alban, but she knew the land and its rhythms with the intimate familiarity of someone who lives under the open sky. Her fingers, trained to crush dried herbs and read the fevered pulse of the sick, sensed the subtle shifts in the air, how it grew denser, almost vibrating before the strange events began. The sweet, earthy scent of her hut, filled with sage, chamomile, and dried moss, was a small refuge against the cold creeping out of the forest. And she could hear, beyond the crackling firewood, distant whispers that weren't the wind but something else. Something old, desperate, and familiar. She remembered her grandmother's frightened eyes as she spoke of the same missing sheep, the same blue flashes she'd seen in her youth. Now Ingrid saw that same fear in the faces of young villagers. It gave her certainty. This wasn't superstition, but a pattern, a wound in the valley's very fabric reopening again. The villagers sought comfort from the church, but the monks offered only words of faith and caution, lacking the deeper, older understanding of the land. Ingrid, as a silent guardian of natural balance, felt compelled to search for the cause of this disharmony, knowing that her search would lead her into places where Christ's cross and the old Norse symbols met in a quiet, ancient struggle of belief and memory. The village lived from fjord fishing and small rocky fields that barely produced enough to survive. The loss of even a single animal or a disrupted routine caused by fear threatened their survival. Life in the Middle Ages, especially in isolated places like this, was a constant act of resilience against cold, hunger, and the unknown. People found comfort in the predictable rhythms of work and faith. But these periodic phenomena shattered that rhythm, breaking the community's fragile harmony. It felt almost as if the land itself were ailing, releasing painful memories into the air, a feeling Ingrid sensed through the strange smell of damp, decaying earth, lingering even on dry nights. Alban's curiosity drove him to break the rules one night, pushed by an almost scholarly need to verify the rumors. He sought the oldest chronicles stored in a cedar cabinet that smelled sweet and dry, finding a rough-bound leather volume dated to the early 11th century. It was the kind of book rarely touched, and the weight of history was palpable in the cold, worn cover. The first striking entry he found was a brief note written in the thin, hurried hand of a monk named Frey, describing ghostly lights over the marsh, accompanied by distant wailing, followed by the loss of 3 goats and the guard dog of the Axel family in the year 1032. Alban skimmed forward and found another nearly identical note by Brother Ragnar, dated 1158, describing ethereal flashes and the disappearance of cattle near the Witch's Grotto, a well-known and feared place near Helvellyn. Shock slowly gave way to a cold certainty. The events weren't merely similar, they were almost exact. Same sequence, same families, as if an invisible script repeated itself every generation. The archive room felt colder, and a chill ran down his spine, not from the temperature, but from the sudden closeness of a pattern that defied logic and doctrine. This pattern, he realized, wasn't random. It was a recurrence, a physical echo of an ancestral trauma. And as any medieval scribe knew, books, especially chronicles, served as humanity's extended memory, guarding against forgetfulness. To protect manuscripts from fire and invasion, constant risks in the Middle Ages, they were often stored in wooden chests or even in small wall niches sealed with wax and relics. Preserving memory was vital, and now Alban understood why. Someday, someone had to connect the dots and break the cycle. He remembered a detail his mentor Ethelwulf once taught him. Medieval scribes often wrote small notes in the margins, marginalia, ranging from spiritual comments to complaints about cold or poor quills. In the margins of the 1158 chronicle, he found a tiny, nearly illegible note, Quaerit extramuenia, look beyond the walls. That made him pause. Brother Ragnar was hinting that the answer wasn't in the abbey's seclusion, but in the land, among the people. Alban's decision was immediate. He needed to speak with someone who understood the valley and its older traditions, someone unbound by the abbey's strictly Christian lens. He needed Ingrid. Visiting her would be seen as heresy, or at best reckless, since healers and herb women lived on the thin border between folk medicine and paganism. But the evidence, the cycle repeating roughly every 120 years, was a call he couldn't ignore. The cold touch of the archive's lock was the last familiar sensation before he stepped into the mystery. The sun had fully set, and darkness swallowed the valley, erasing the mountain's outline. Alban slipped through the abbey's side gate, his wool habit wrapped tight, the night sky a cold blanket of stars. The icy wind cut his face as his soft leather shoes pressed into the frozen ground. He carried a small parchment map he'd secretly copied, marking the location of an ancient ruined pagan temple described in the chronicles as the place where the old god sleeps. As he walked the narrow, winding trail toward Velven, his knowledge of Viking burial customs surfaced. Before Norway's Christianization, powerful leaders were buried in great earth mounds, often with belongings, or even their ships, to carry them to Valhalla. Lights and disappearances might hint at a disturbed burial, an interrupted ritual, or a forgotten pact. The idea gave terrifying depth to the recent events, transforming them from ghost stories into something rooted in cultural memory. His small tallow lantern fought desperately against the dense darkness, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move with him. His unease grew, and he steadied his breath with silent prayers. The texture of his habit, once a comfort, now felt like thin armor against unseen forces hiding among the pines. He heard a distant rush of water, a fast, icy brook, and the smell of dew settling on the earth was the only sign of life beyond his own heartbeat. Ingrid's hut sat at the forest's edge, deliberately set apart from the village, a meeting point between the civilized world and the wild. Moss-covered stones lined the path, and the feeling of being watched pressed heavily on him. He thought of medieval hermits who chose similar solitude, seeking God in silence and facing visions and temptations. Alban wasn't a hermit, but this journey felt like a solitary pilgrimage, one that challenged both faith and reason. As he approached, a faint, warm light filtered through the hut's single horn-glass window, a comforting promise of heat in the freezing night. The smell of peat smoke and something herbal, sharp and medicinal drifted from the stone chimney. He paused, resting a hand on the rough bark of a pine tree, gathering his final courage. His fascination with medieval mysteries was a powerful force, but breaking the monastic rule weighed on him, a small price, perhaps, for the peace of an entire valley and for souls trapped in time. He knocked softly on the heavy wooden door, feeling its rough surface beneath his fingers. In the vast silence, the sound seemed thunderous. The cold, damp air around him contrasted sharply with the warmth he sensed inside. He waited, drawing a deep breath, as faint movement sounded from within. He held the certainty of the records and the hope that Ingrid could translate what the monks' formal Latin could not, the folklore, the legend, the truth rooted deep in the land. The door opened slowly, and Ingrid appeared, wrapped in dark wool shawls, her silhouette framed by firelight behind her, her pale blue eyes fixed on Alban and his monastic robe. She read his urgency instantly. People who read nature often read people just as well. The herbal scent grew stronger, almost intoxicating. Alban's first instinct was to apologize for disturbing her so late, but the words stuck. Instead, he simply showed her the parchment map and whispered, 1032, 1158, 1285. They repeat. His voice, deeper than he expected, broke the night's stillness. Ingrid didn't look surprised. Her eyes narrowed slightly in recognition, and the expression on her time-worn face showed she'd reached the same conclusion, just by different means. Her slow, steady breathing revealed her natural calm, which eased some of Alban's tension. With a quiet nod, she stepped aside. "Come in, Brother Alban. The valley guards its secrets stubbornly, but the land also speaks to those who know how to hear its rhythm." Alban crossed the threshold and felt the welcome shock of warm air. The wind's howl vanished, replaced by crackling firewood and the gentle bubbling of a small pot. A familiar thought stirred in him. Back in the Viking Age, churches didn't exist here, only wooden temples, and rituals were held under the open sky. His search for medieval mysteries had led him away from the comfort of Christian certainty and straight into the heart of Old Norse belief, a dangerous, fascinating meeting of eras. The relief of finding an ally soothed his restless soul. The air was thick with herbs and the promise of a truth that could only be uncovered together, combining monastic knowledge with the healer's natural wisdom. Ingrid poured a dark, steaming tea from a clay pot, its herbal scent filling the room. "Angelica root," she said. "It calms the mind." Alban felt the warmth seep into his cold hands as he held the cup. He sat on a wooden stool, sensing its rough surface, and the tea's sweet aroma wrapped around him. Firelight danced across the hut's walls, and for the first time that night he felt genuine peace, the quiet relief of finally taking action. "What's the price of this repetition, Ingrid?" he asked, his voice low, eyes on the steaming liquid. Ingrid looked into the fire, the flames reflected in her calm blue gaze. "The price, Alban, is the soul. Something was trapped here, and every time the cycle returns, they try once again to find the light. But the curse pulls them back into the cold, back into the valley's darkness." The poetic image lingered, that small human flame battling the vast ancient cold outside, a perfect metaphor for the struggle ahead, between the light of understanding and the shadows of superstition and pain. Alban drank the hot tea, feeling the comforting bitterness of the Angelica root and the warmth spreading through his body, a welcome contrast to the damp chill still lingering in the air. He set the cup down on the wooden table, its surface smooth and glossy from decades of use, and unrolled the 1032 Chronicle for Ingrid, pointing to Brother Frey's tense handwriting. The flickering light of the fire and the lamp cast shifting shadows over the medieval script, making the letters seem to move ever so slightly, as if the past itself were struggling to step forward again. He explained the pattern, the precision of the losses and the repeating cycle, offering the logical world of written record to meet Ingrid's intuitive wisdom. Ingrid listened in quiet focus, her eyes fixed on the timeline Alban had traced. She didn't need written dates to feel the repetition. For her, the valley's memory was carved into tree roots and heard in the sound of stones tumbling down the mountains. The historical curiosity she shared was rooted in the Norse belief in Ragnarok, a cycle of destruction and renewal. This repetition of catastrophic events, even in a smaller, local scale, seemed like a fragment of that doctrine of eternal return, where past mistakes become inescapable for the present, and that was written clearly, not on parchment, but in the sadness in the villagers' eyes. She touched the edge of the parchment with the tip of her finger, a gentle gesture of respect toward Brother Frey's memory. "It's not the land that's sick, Alban," she said, her voice low and resonant. "It's a man's memory that was buried badly. There's an old belief that if a warrior dies with a broken promise or an unfulfilled vengeance, he can be trapped in the place where he fell, forced to relive the moment of his pain or failure." She looked at the monk. "The lights in the marsh aren't random ghosts. They're torches that went out and flare up again in a moment of desperation." Ingrid stood and walked over to a rough shelf, returning with a small object, a polished piece of bone, carved with what looked like ancient runes, worn down by time and handling. The bone felt cold and smooth to the touch, a sharp contrast to the rough wool in her hands. "My grandfather gave me this. He said it came from the pagan temple before the church was built. It's the symbol of Not, the personification of night. It serves as a map to the cold hill place where the old warriors were committed to the earth." Alban felt the significance of the object almost physically. He'd read in the abbey's records that when the first missionaries tried to convert the valley in the 11th century, they often built churches directly on top of pagan temples to symbolize the triumph of the new faith. It was effective as a strategy, but it often led to a subtle contamination where the energy and beliefs of the old place remained, sleeping just beneath the surface, mixing with Christian doctrine in complex and not always harmonious ways. It was the kind of historical detail that explained why ancestral fears held on so stubbornly. The chronicles mention a curse, but they call it the punishment of the deceived, Alban murmured, flipping through the pages faster than usual. Brother Fry wrote that in the year 1030, a Viking chieftain was betrayed by his own men and left to die in an incomplete ritual near the marsh. He cursed the valley to relive his betrayal every time the constellation of the Great Raven returned to the same place in the sky. The healer nodded, taking Alban's lantern in hand. The Great Raven, or Hrafnin Mikli, is a constellation that can only be clearly seen every 120 years at this latitude. It's Odin's mark, the god of wisdom and war. The cycle isn't random, it's celestial. The monk recorded the curse, but not the ritual to break it. You, Brother Alban, brought the when. I have the where. The temperature inside the hut felt as if it had shifted. The fire's warmth no longer seemed enough to chase away the chill of the mystery hanging over them. Alban felt the weight of responsibility, along with a light-headed rush of adrenaline. To perform the ritual, they would have to go to the ruins of the pagan temple, a place the villagers avoided at all costs, reachable only by a dangerous climb in the mountain's darkness. He looked around Ingrid's hut, taking in the simple tools, mortars and pestles, wicker baskets for gathering herbs. The silence was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft sound of their breathing. This was the small human story he now found himself in, the unlikely alliance of a scholar of the faith and a guardian of the natural world, both chasing the same goal, peace. Ingrid quickly packed a leather satchel. She placed inside a small handful of coarse sea salt for purification, a dried sprig of mistletoe, a symbol of life and protection, and a little flask of water from the highest river, known for its ritual purity. The scent of the mistletoe was strong and balsamic, blending with the smell of burning wood. Alban, in turn, put on a travel cloak, the kind the abbey kept for long journeys, and grabbed his own flask. The contrast between the learned monk and the practical healer was subtle but powerful. He was used to the slow rhythm of the scriptorium, and this sudden burst of movement felt like a welcome yet unsettling departure from his routine. Another historical detail crossed his mind. In the Middle Ages, the church often used perfumed oils and incense in its rites to ward off evil spirits. Ingrid, on the other hand, relied on the sharp scent of local herbs like juniper and angelica to create a natural protective barrier. The intention was the same, only the source of power differed. "We have to move before midnight," Ingrid said. "That's when the line between worlds is thinnest. The Great Raven will be at its zenith." And they stepped out of the hut, and the cold air greeted them once more. The ground beneath their feet was hard and uneven, and Alban felt each small stone through the soles of his shoes, a direct connection to the earth he rarely experienced in abbey life. The wind now carried a low, distant hum, an electric feeling of anticipation. Alban's trust in the written word and Ingrid's trust in the spoken word and nature's signs created an unexpected balance. He held proof of the repetition. She held the path to breaking it. The journey itself was a kind of ritual, an act of shared faith in knowledge. Darkness was the valley's dominant texture, broken only by distant pinpricks of village light and the soft, steady glow of the cold stars overhead. They began to climb the trail, moving with the quiet precision of those who know the land. Alban watched Ingrid's figure ahead of him, her steps firm and sure. He wondered about her life, about the cost of carrying the weight of old traditions in a world increasingly ruled by the new faith and its learned men. His curiosity was now entirely focused on the ritual. What would break the cycle? A Christian prayer, a Norse incantation, or perhaps some careful blend of the two, a harmony only this stubbornly ancient and isolated place could allow. The sound of running water, once distant, grew louder, becoming a constant cold presence. The stream rushed by, and the smell of wet stone and minerals was strong in the air. They stopped to cross it on a natural bridge of slick stones, and Alban felt the very real danger of the night and their haste, the risk of slipping into the freezing water below. That sense of precariousness was a vivid reminder of how fragile medieval life truly was. Ingrid raised a warning hand. They had to move carefully. Even in the dark, there was always the chance that some villager might spot them and report everything to the abbot. The fear of paganism was real and merciless. The small human story continued. Two opposites joined by a paradox. A monk bound to rules and a healer bound to nature, walking side by side under the watchful gaze of the great raven. The murmur of the wind through the trees, once threatening, now sounded like a distant lament, an ethereal chorus announcing their approach to the place of ancestral pain. They were drawing near to the cold hill place. What remained was the image of Alban's faint lantern light, guided by Ingrid's quiet knowledge, a small sphere of reason and warmth, moving through a vast, ancient darkness that seemed to breathe in slow cycles of pain and repetition. The valley was waiting. The climb up the mountainside quickly proved steep and silent, forcing Alban to focus all his attention on the ground beneath his feet. The earth now felt like a mix of loose gravel and exposed roots, demanding a physical effort that stood in sharp contrast to the quiet predictability of monastic life. The forest's scent grew heavier, the resinous aroma of fresh pine mingling with the colder smell of snow gathered in sheltered pockets, untouched by the wind. He could hear the sound of his own footsteps and Ingrid's steady breathing beside him, a soft, rhythmic melody that helped keep his mind calm in the vast darkness. The rigid pace of abbey life was now replaced with the slow rhythm of a walk under the starlit sky, and that simple change was enough to open his mind to a new way of seeing the world. About 100 meters ahead, Alban felt the first sign of the disturbance, a sudden, inexplicable wave of cutting cold that didn't come from the wind, but seemed to rise straight from the earth, slipping through wool and bone. Ingrid noticed him shiver and pointed toward a cluster of rocks looming in the darkness, covered in a patchwork of almost black moss. "We're close to the cold hill place. That cold is the sign that death's energy is trapped here, unable to move on." She took a small pinch of dried mistletoe from her bag, warming it between her palms until its balsamic, protective scent filled the air. Ingrid stood, sage smoke rising in a straight column, and took the rune bone from Alban's hand. The touch of it was smooth and quietly charged, the focal point of their connection to the past. She placed it at the center of the flat stone, once the altar, inside the circle of salt Alban had drawn. The hissing wind seemed to pull back, as if the salt barrier truly were holding back whatever lingered outside. Alban watched each of her movements with the attentive gaze of a scribe, recording every detail of the ritual in his mind, understanding that this was a form of writing as old as the abbey chronicles themselves. She then unwrapped a small linen bundle, revealing a mixture of ground herbs, valerian root, oak bark, and petals of wild lupine. The scent rising from it was earthy and slightly sharp, a strong aroma that overtook the lingering smell of sage. She scattered the herbs over the rune bone, an act of offering and respect. The serenity on her face was complete, and Alban felt that calm seep into him, easing the restlessness that had clung to him since the night began. A quiet understanding that fear was being replaced by action. Alban opened his small breviary and began reciting the prayer for the dead, not the formal requiem, but the part that spoke of eternal light. He used the rhythmic cadence monastic life had taught him, turning the Latin into a steady, hypnotic murmur meant to guide lost souls toward peace. The sound of his prayer and the scent of Ingrid's herbs blended into a thick sensory field, where Christian faith and natural wisdom moved toward a single purpose. A historical curiosity rose in him. In medieval Scandinavia, many pagan rituals weren't completely erased, but adapted, Christianized. Offerings of herbs and natural symbols were often allowed if performed in the name of a saint or with a priest's blessing, a form of cultural syncretism the Church tolerated to ease conversion in remote regions. Their unofficial ritual embodied that syncretism perfectly, a search for a solution that honored every era at once. As Alban recited, the blue light over the marsh in the distance began to intensify. No longer dancing, it pulsed, slow and aching, like a failing heartbeat. Alban felt the sharp cold gather around them, and the distant cries grew clearer, now carrying scattered words, incomprehensible yet full of betrayal's raw emotion. Inside the salt circle, however, the air held a soft warmth, violently opposed to the cold pressing in from outside. Ingrid lifted the river water flask and touched a few drops to Alban's lips, a gesture of strength and renewal. She looked toward the lights over the marsh and spoke in Old Norse, her voice firm. Bjorn Olafsson, the promise was broken by human hands, not by the earth. You cursed their descendants, but the cycle must end. Betrayal is not eternal. Accept forgiveness. Find your peace. Her rhythmic repetition was like a hammer striking the same spot, trying to crack open spiritual stubbornness. The small human story they belonged to now was a direct confrontation with the suffering of a man from centuries past, an attempt to offer a different ending to a tragic tale. The Viking warrior's life, cut short by greed, had become the source of fear and disharmony in the valley, and they were the only mediators between injustice and redemption. The monk felt compelled to unite the power of written record with the power of belief. He held up the open parchment where Brother Frey had written of the curse and offered it to the wind, a gesture of returning the story to nature. The wrong is recorded, the truth revealed. The book no longer holds your pain, Bjorn. Your story is complete, he said, his voice steady. As he did, the blue light over the marsh shuddered violently. Alban caught a sudden scent of salt water and iron, the smell of a Viking ship and fresh blood, an instant-long sensory hallucination strong enough to dizzy him. He steadied himself with the rough texture of the salt beneath his knees, a grounding anchor. Predicting the manifestation, Ingrid lit a small fragment of beeswax. Its sweet, clean scent rose into the air, a perfect counterpoint to the metallic odor Alban had sensed, an offering of purity to neutralize the stain of betrayal. The warmth of its tiny flame was surprising, a steady island of soft light. The healer began walking slowly around the salt circle, ringing the bronze bell in gentle beats. The sound was sharper now, more piercing, a final call. She repeated, "Leave the valley, leave the sleep, follow the light, follow the raven." Her slow, circular steps had a hypnotic rhythm, a pattern of movement that invited contemplation. Alban looked down at the runes carved into the bone, feeling its cold surface. He noticed that the rune for journey, Raido, seemed more prominent, as if waiting to be awakened. He understood that the warrior needed one last push, the confirmation that his path to peace was finally open. He glanced toward the abbey, its dark towers only faint silhouettes now, and felt the stark contrast between seclusion and action. Knowledge wasn't meant only for copying. It existed to mend the world's wounds, both the visible and the unseen. A historical memory surfaced. The Norse concept of verigild, the price paid to end a blood feud. In a way, Ingrid and Alban's ritual was the verigild offered to Bjorn's spirit, a payment of peace to end his centuries-long vengeance. As Ingrid's final repetition faded, the blue marsh light began to soften. It didn't vanish. It grew paler, gentler, and slowly began to rise, lifting itself toward the sky, drifting upward toward the zenith, toward the great Raven constellation. The cries stopped at once. The silence that followed was no longer the heavy, haunted silence of earlier, but something light and clean. The silence of peace finally reached a soothing hush. Alban felt the extreme cold vanish entirely, replaced by a natural, gentle warmth, the warmth of a resting earth. His tense muscles loosened, and a wave of physical relief washed over him. Ingrid smiled, a wide, tired smile. She pointed to the rising light. He found his ship. He found the way. A swell of gratitude rose in Alban for the healer, for the ancestral knowledge she carried, for the way formal faith and earth wisdom had worked together to undo the curse. The rune bone on the altar seemed to glow faintly under the moonlight. The ritual was complete, and the pattern had been broken. Alban looked up at the sky and saw the great raven at its highest point, a silent witness to the closing of the cycle. Serenity settled completely. They had rewritten the ending of a centuries-old saga with the quill of faith and the ink of nature. The monk recalled a small historical detail he'd once read about Norse customs, the deep importance of trolls and nature spirits believed to live in hills and stones. Even after Christianization, people kept a quiet fear and respect for such beings, avoiding certain places, especially at night. That subtle belief that rocks had life and memory helped explain the village's terror. What surrounded him now was a gentle mystery, the way faith and superstition intertwined, forming a cultural tapestry far richer and more complex than either one alone. They finally reached the top of a ridge. The wind was stronger there, almost a mournful howl. Below, in a small clearing, lay the ruins of the pagan temple, little more than a circle of tall standing stones, some toppled, others still upright, like broken teeth in the darkness. The silence around the ruins was heavy, a soundless void that swallowed the forest's usual noise, a strange and macabre stillness. Alban caught the scent of wet earth, and faintly, a metallic sweetness. Like dried blood, a lingering memory of what had happened there centuries before. Ingrid stopped at the entrance to the ruins and pulled a small bronze bell from her bag. She rang it gently, its clear, pure note breaking the silence with a breath of life. A bronze bell keeps most spirits away. It marks what belongs to us and what belongs to them, she whispered. The brief sense of safety the sound created was a comfort to Alban. The deeper mystery was humanity's timeless need to draw boundaries and create rituals to face the unseen. The monk reached out and touched one of the standing stones, feeling its cold, rough surface covered in patches of greenish lichen. He could almost feel its age. The weight of centuries of devotion and sacrifice pressed into its core. He thought of the scribes before him who, like him, had felt the urgency of truth and dared to venture beyond the abbey's walls to record what theological logic couldn't explain, risking being dismissed as mere collectors of legends. Ingrid uncorked the flask of river water and sprinkled a few drops over the fallen stones, a gesture of purification and respect for the trapped souls. Then she began murmuring words in an old language Alban recognized as archaic Norse, a prayer about honor, betrayal, and the search for rest in Gimle, the Norse heaven. The sound of that guttural, poetic tongue blended with the wind's howl until the air seemed to thrum with a ritual chorus carried by the cold mountain night. Alban took the rune-carved bone that Ingrid had shown him earlier and held it tightly, feeling its smooth, cold weight in his hands. He knew it was a key, a fragment of the old belief system. He could see the mystery of life and death repeating itself, and how, in medieval times, life moved in cycles of work and rest. But for the souls trapped in the valley, that cycle had been broken, forcing them to relive their final moments every 120 years. Another historical thought bloomed in his mind. The Skalds, the Viking poets and storytellers who served as guardians of memory, passing their sagas along orally for generations. The curse in the valley was, in its own way, a saga retold by the spirits themselves, an attempt to break the silence and let the final chapter be rewritten with peace. As Ingrid continued her murmuring, Alban caught once again the sweet, earthy scent of moisture and moss, the scent of the marsh's memory. Looking down, he saw small blue lights flickering far away, dancing above the still water. The air around his skin suddenly felt warmer, as if touched by heat from a distant, invisible fire, a startling contrast to the cold. He began reading aloud the marginal note written by Brother Ragnar, "Seek beyond the walls," turning the silence of the night into an act of penitence for the abbey's long forgetfulness. To him, the repetition wasn't just a mystery, but a historical error that needed correction, an act of charity toward the dead. Ingrid's voice rose slightly as she spoke the names of the old gods, Odin, Thor and Freya, not in worship, but in acknowledgement of their ancient jurisdiction. She was asking for permission to intervene in the valley's memory, a gesture of respect toward an ancestral cosmology. Alban felt the place's serenity begin to shift into a subtle unease. The wind's voice turned erratic, and beneath it he could hear what sounded like distant cries, muffled human voices filled with pain and betrayal rising from the marsh below. The healer turned to him, and the moon, now breaking through the clouds, lit her eyes. They're reliving the moment of the betrayal. The warrior Bjorn Olafsson, he was abandoned there, and his spirit refuses to let the valley forget. Alban remembered the part of the chronicle that mentioned the lost goats and the family Axel's guard dog. The tragedy wasn't only about Bjorn, it was about the people he had cursed as he died, the descendants of those who betrayed him. He took the coarse sea salt from Ingrid's bag and began tracing a circle on the ground around a large flat stone that must once have been the temple's altar. The granular sound of salt falling on earth was soft and rhythmic, creating a physical and symbolic boundary. Ingrid knelt and lit a small bundle of sage. Its strong, cleansing scent filled the air, cutting through the metallic odor that still lingered. The smoke rose in a steady spiral, a visible sign that the ritual had begun. What unfolded before him was a gentle mystery, the synchronization of written history and ritual history, the way the words of a monk dead for centuries spoke to the gestures of a living healer. Alban felt Ingrid's warmth beside him as she guided him, a subtle touch of collaboration in the midst of darkness and fear. He began reciting a psalm in Latin, De profundis clamavi ad te, Domine. Out of the depths I cry to you, Lord, a plea for redemption. The Christian prayer blended with Ingrid's Norse invocation, a fusion of faith and tradition seeking the same peace. There was serenity on Ingrid's face, calm, unwavering determination. She trusted the rhythm of the earth. Alban trusted the strength of the word. Together they formed an anchor in the night, The cries from the marsh grew weaker, fading into a faint whisper, as if the ritual were beginning to break through the repetition's volume. Alban noticed the starlight seemed brighter now, the great raven constellation resting at its zenith, marking the exact time for the ritual. The slow shift in the sky felt like a sign that the heavens were watching. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the cold air and the firmness of the salt under his feet, searching for the same concentration the scriptorium had taught him, but now with an urgency that carried the weight of an entire valley. The bone in his hand was his reminder that he stood between faith and legend, and he tightened his grip, channeling courage into his fingers. Ingrid looked at him then, her lips curving into a small, quiet smile, the first hint of hope he'd seen all night, a silent invitation to continue the ritual, the monk and the healer side by side, defying a centuries-old curse with the strength of unity and knowledge. With the ritual complete, a deep, restorative stillness settled over the ruins of the old pagan temple. Alban and Ingrid remained seated on the cold stone of the altar for a long moment, simply feeling the air at rest. The scent of burned sage and healing herbs was slowly fading, leaving behind only the clean smell of dew and pine. The silence, once a tense absence, was now a presence, soft and peaceful, and the monk felt relief flow through his tired muscles, a lightness that contrasted with the heavy weight of the chronicles he had carried. It was the first step toward truly understanding the consequence, peace returning to the valley. Ingrid picked up the rune bone. Its surface, once cold and heavy with trapped energy, now felt warm to the touch, emptied of the restless force that had clung to it. She wrapped it again in the small piece of linen. "He's at peace now," she whispered, her voice soft and freed of the night's urgency. Alban felt a wave of quiet contemplation, thinking of how one man's pain, Björn Olafsson, had rippled through generations, and how the simple union of knowledge and pure intention had finally loosened the knot of time. Alban looked up to the great raven constellation. It had drifted west of the zenith, beginning its slow descent across the night sky, and he understood just how precise Ingrid's timing had been. A historical curiosity rose in him. For Viking sailors and medieval farmers, the stars had never been mere celestial ornaments. They were guides for navigation and harvest, a natural calendar far more reliable than any handwritten chart in the abbey. His thoughts turned to the small human story of the Axel family, who had lost livestock in 1032 and again in 1158, likely descendants of those who had betrayed the warrior. With the cycle broken, the ancestral debt born from that old act of treachery was finally settled. Life in the Middle Ages was marked by such debts of honor, and peace in the valley ultimately depended on the restoration of a moral balance broken centuries before. Ingrid pointed toward the marsh. The blue lights were gone entirely, and the night was uniformly dark again, free of that ethereal glow. The soundscape of the valley had shifted too. The eerie lament was replaced by the distant murmur of wind over the fjords, and the soft, rhythmic trickle of a nearby stream, a harmless and natural sound, with no sorrow hidden beneath it. Alban felt the urge to say thank you, but words seemed too small. Instead, he joined Ingrid in gathering what remained of the ritual: salt, wax, and sage ash. It was an act of respect toward the land and toward the closing of their work, a physical and spiritual ending. The earth beneath his fingers was cool and damp, but no longer held the supernatural cold he had felt earlier. As they worked, Ingrid shared a local historical tale, the legend of the Huldra, forest women said to protect livestock and woodlands, yet known to avenge the desecration of their sacred places. This temple site, she believed, had once belonged to a Huldra, and the church built over its roots had disturbed that harmony. Bjorn's curse was only one expression of a deeper imbalance. Alban, thinking like a scribe, pondered the importance of preserving memory. The monks had recorded the curse, but Ingrid had preserved the cultural key to understanding it. Knowledge, he realized, was only complete when faith and folklore, written word and oral tradition, met in harmony. True wisdom lived outside the abbey walls. The air's temperature was rising little by little, a sign that dawn was approaching. The scent of dew gathering on birch leaves grew stronger, sweet and fresh, a quiet signal of a new day and the end of their vigil. Alban's serene contemplation turned to the fragile nature of peace and the responsibility of maintaining it. They began descending the trail back toward Velven. The path that earlier had felt like a dark and perilous maze now seemed open and familiar under the faint glow rising in the eastern horizon. The monk could see the outline of the mountains again, a majestic line of snow-covered peaks blessing the valley with their silent watch. Ingrid shared another piece of medieval Norwegian lore, the tradition of the stavkirke, wooden churches built with advanced carpentry techniques that often featured dragons and other Norse symbols carved into the architecture. Another example of how the new faith had adopted remnants of the old to ensure the people's acceptance. As they descended, the abbey bell began to ring in the distance, calling the monks to lauds. The sound was pure and far away, and Alban felt the familiar pull of monastic duty, but now with a new perspective. His prayers would carry the knowledge of the land and of the souls he had helped set free. He noticed the moss covering the stones along the trail, vibrant green, and thought of nature's resilience. Life in the valley would continue in spite of curses and spiritual conflicts, a constant cycle of renewal celebrated in medieval seasonal festivals. Ingrid said, breaking the curse wasn't the only thing that mattered, Alban. What mattered was reminding everyone that the pain of the ancestors doesn't have to be the pain of the descendants. The story is healed, and the cycle is gone forever. That was the heart of the night's lesson, the liberation of the warrior, yes, but also of the valley's very memory. The monk felt the warmth of the rising sun touch his face, a gentle welcome warmth that erased the cold of the night and the lingering chill of the marsh. He caught the salty scent of the fjord drifting in the air, blending with the clean pine smoke rising from the chimneys of Velven. He looked toward the waking village, and the sight of the small wooden houses nestled in the valley brought him a quiet satisfaction. The place was finally free of the cycle of terror. And he, the silent scribe, had been the unlikely instrument of that liberation. Alban's serene reflection now belonged to a man who had discovered a new purpose in his work. The Abbey's chronicles would no longer be dry records of the past, but maps for healing the present, sources of practical and spiritual wisdom. He thought of the medieval healer, often overlooked yet essential. Ingrid had been the guardian of balance, and he had been her counterpart, the bridge between script and life. Birdsong filled the air, a gentle chorus welcoming the new day, a melodic contrast to the mournful wind they'd heard among the ruins. The small human story had reached its end, the monk and the healer, returning from the mountain, carrying proof of peace and the secret of release. The morning's image was the rising sun, not just illuminating the valley, but warming the souls that had been freed, an invitation to renewal and to letting old pains finally rest. Alban felt the texture of his habit beneath his hands, and it seemed lighter now, more meaningful. He was ready to return to the Abbey with a new story to record, not a repetition, but the end of one. They walked down the hill toward the village of Velven, and the sun was now fully risen, casting a soft golden glow over the pine trees and the dark wooden houses. The sound of roosters crowing and the smell of pine smoke grew stronger with each step, a comforting return to everyday life, now cleansed of its cycle of fear. Alban could almost feel the familiar texture of the abbey's wooden halls in his mind. But now he saw the place differently. Not as a refuge of isolation, but as a repository of stories meant to be read with the heart of the land. Ingrid stopped at the edge of the forest, where the trail met the gravel road leading into the village. She reached into her leather satchel and pulled out a small piece of mistletoe, a symbol of peace and protection in Norse tradition. She split it into 2 pieces and handed one to Alban. "For you, guardian of the written word, and for me, guardian of the whispered one. The memory of the night must stay with us, but the peace belongs to everyone." The mistletoe felt soft and velvety, and its balsamic scent was a physical reminder of the ritual. The monk accepted it, placing it reverently in the inner pocket of his habit. He knew that this small plant, given by a healer, was just as sacred as any relic kept in the abbey chapel, for it represented redemption. A historical note flickered in his mind. In the Middle Ages, mistletoe was considered miraculous, used both for healing and as an amulet against demons and spells, a meeting point where folk medicine and mysticism intertwined inseparably. He looked at the healer, whose blue eyes reflected the serene, pale sky of early morning. "I'll return to the abbey with a new understanding," he said. "Prior Valerian must not learn of the ritual, but the chronicles must be updated. The end of the curse must be recorded so it never returns. The truth now is peace." Ingrid nodded. "The truth lives in the earth, Alban. If the next generation forgets, the cycle may try to return. But time is in harmony now, and the warrior is on his final journey." She offered a simple nod, a small, respectful farewell. Their brief yet intense partnership, bridging monastery and forest, had reached its end. The monk turned and began walking quickly toward the abbey. The sound of his steps on the gravel was the only noise, and he could feel the growing warmth of the sun on his back. He wondered how he would record the event, perhaps with a larger, clearer marginal note that broke centuries of silence and guided the next scribe toward the truth of the valley's mysteries. A historical curiosity struck him again. In the early Middle Ages, scribes didn't just copy texts, they often acted as local chroniclers, recording weather patterns, notable births, and, like Brother Frey, unusual phenomena. Alban's account would prove that this role, the monk as guardian of the community's living memory, was still necessary. He noticed the rich smell of fresh bread wafting from the abbey kitchen, a scent of life and routine, a strong contrast to the night's odors of death and herbs. The feel of the mistletoe in his pocket was the only physical proof that the night had been real, and not some fevered dream, a small anchor between faith and folklore. When he reached the abbey gates, their grey stones now golden in the morning light, Alban felt the serenity of the place. He knew he was returning to seclusion, but not to isolation. His mind carried the rhythm of the earth, the sound of the bell, and Ingrid's ancient words, a fusion that made his faith deeper and more expansive. The gatekeeper, an elderly monk named Brother Gervasio, opened the heavy oak door. He asked nothing, only greeted Alban with a quiet nod. The monk stepped inside and felt the cool air of the abbey contrast with the warmth of the sun, a symbolic passage from the outer world to the inner. Alban walked straight to the scriptorium. The scent of iron gall ink and parchment filled the air, and he sat at his desk. He didn't begin copying the homilies. Instead, he opened the 13th century chronicle, the volume where Brother Ragnar had written his final note about the recurring mysteries. He took up a new quill and dipped it into dark ink. The soft, rhythmic scratching of the pen against parchment became his prayer. With a steady hand, one that knew the truth, he began to write the story of the curse and the way it had ended. In the year of grace 1285, he wrote, when the great raven reached its zenith, the cycle of the punishment of the deceived was, by the mercy of God and the wisdom of the earth, broken forever. The souls of Bjorn Olafsson and of those who betrayed him found their rest, and the valley of Velven was cleansed of the repetition of sorrow. The lesson, the abbey's knowledge, must always walk hand in hand with the wisdom of nature. The serene contemplation that surrounded him was the understanding that peace, in the Middle Ages, was not simply the absence of conflict. It was an achievement, a constant struggle against forgetfulness and disharmony. His role as a scribe was more than preserving the past, it was safeguarding the future. He looked out the scriptorium window. The sun gleamed on the snow-covered mountains. Birds sang, their voices reaching even through the thick stone walls, a gentle chorus welcoming the new day. The poetic final image was his quill, an instrument of the scribe, not copying the divine, but recording the liberation of an ancestral curse, the union of faith with the deepest threads of human history. The monk felt the warmth of sunlight filtering through the horn-paneled window, touching the parchment, warming the ink that dried as it sealed the valley's peace forever. He closed the chronicle with a firm, final thud, a gesture of completion. The work was done, and the valley was safe. Peace was not the absence of sound, but the harmony of life's sounds, birdsong, the murmur of the quill, the smell of bread. Alban knew that from this day on, his work would be a silent prayer of gratitude for the wisdom he had found beyond the walls. His story was written, the mystery had ended, the valley slept in peace. The gentle sound of Alban's quill across the parchment had faded, but the stillness of the scriptorium wasn't empty. It was filled with the soft murmur of the abbey's morning routine, the distant chant of the monks reciting the first hour, and the comforting smell of breakfast being prepared in the kitchen. He rose from his hard wooden chair, feeling the relief of stretching his muscles after a long vigil and an even longer writing session. Sunlight streamed through the narrow windows, casting warm stripes across the work tables, an almost sensory passage from the cold darkness of the valley to the contained brightness of the monastery. Yet Alban felt he had brought the forest with him, a small piece of the wild truth now living inside him. He needed a change in perspective, a gentle shift from the act of recording to observing the effect his work might have on the life of the abbey, however subtle. Alban walked down the main corridor, its grey stone walls cool to the touch, breathing in the dense morning air. He came upon Brother Elias the gardener, who was lighting the furnace in the central heating room, a small historical curiosity, a carefully maintained system that kept the abbey warm through the harsh Norwegian winter. The smell of burning wood and the rising heat from the iron stove were a welcoming contrast to the chill of the stone and the crisp air of dawn. Elias, a man whose skin was marked by years of sun and frost, looked at Alban. There was a rare hint of relief in his eyes, and his usually low, grumbling voice carried surprising cheer. "The prior says John's missing sheep were found near the marsh, Brother Alban. Not a single scratch on them. The fear vanished with the night, it seems." His small human story was confirmation enough. The absence of tragedy, of repetition, was the clearest sign their ritual had worked. The emotional and sensory impact rippled through the abbey immediately, for its daily life depended on the well-being of the valley's livestock. The monk felt the warmth of Elias's joy and the weight of his own discretion. He could not reveal the ritual he'd performed with Ingrid, but he could absorb the serenity that peace had brought. A historical curiosity drifted through his mind. Many northern medieval abbeys relied on complex hippocaust systems, furnaces and channels beneath stone floors, to keep monks from freezing during prayer and work. Brother Elias's furnace was the quiet, vital heart of the abbey. Alban continued down the hallway, his steps softened by the steady murmur of prayer. He climbed to the choir gallery, where morning light spilled through simple, sparse stained glass windows, casting cool and coloured shapes across the floor. He looked out over the valley. Velven lay wrapped in a gentle mist, not mysterious this time, but resting as if the land itself were in a deep, peaceful sleep. It was a serenity he had never witnessed before. This shift in perspective mattered greatly, from the claustrophobia of writing to the vastness of the landscape. The contrast between the abbey's cold stone and the valley's warm life felt balanced now. Alban could see the thin smoke rising from the village's chimneys, a sign that their routines had resumed without fear. The warm sensation of sunlight filtering through the stained glass onto his face was a physical reminder of blessing. He thought about how medieval life was governed by strict rules, the rule of St. Benedict in the abbey and local customs in the village. Bjorn Olavsson's curse had been a violation of order, a law unwritten yet powerful, forcing tragedy to repeat itself. Their intervention had restored that order, bringing spiritual law back into alignment with nature's law. He sat on a wooden bench in the gallery, feeling the rough grain beneath his hands. The faint scent of incense clung to the chapel air, mingling with the cool, damp smell of old stone, an aroma of devotion and time. He closed his eyes and allowed himself a moment of quiet contemplation, listening to the abbey's rhythm, the soft, continuous flow of Latin chants. Another historical thought surfaced. After Lauds, the monks would take their jentaculum, a simple breakfast which, in the poorer northern abbeys, consisted of bread and weak beer or porridge. A frugal beginning, part of the monastic discipline. This unchanging pattern of life stood in stark contrast to the valley's former restlessness. Alban's thoughts drifted to Ingrid, the healer, making her way back to her cabin. What would she do now? He imagined her returning to her everyday tasks, gathering herbs, preparing salves, tending to the sick, but carrying the deep satisfaction of having completed a greater spiritual duty. Her small human story was that of a guardian who had fulfilled her purpose, and he felt grateful she had shared her knowledge, a treasure as valuable as any manuscript. The light in the gallery shifted, and Alban felt the warmth intensify behind his eyelids. He realized that true liberation had not only come to the valley, but to him as well, from the confines of a faith that sometimes grew blind to the mystery and magic woven into creation. He had found God outside the walls, in the union of nature and folklore. The bells rang, announcing the end of prayer and the start of the workday. It was his cue to return to his duties. He descended the spiral stone staircase, feeling the cool, polished steps beneath his feet. The smell of wax and polish from the lower halls was strong, a scent of order and cleanliness marking the civilized world. He thought of how life in the valley would now change. Families would sleep without fear of blue lights, livestock would no longer vanish, and the whisper inside people's hearts would be one of relief rather than terror. His serene reflection was that a simple act of courage and cooperation had changed the destiny of an entire community. Alban passed through the refectory, where long oak tables were being set for the monks. The soft clink of wooden utensils was a rhythmic counterpoint to the silence traditionally observed during meals. The scent of oat porridge and rye bread lingered in the air, a smell of nourishment and routine that soothed him. He paused by a stained glass window depicting Saint Olav, Norway's holy king. The saint held an axe and a cross, a symbol of the harsh Christianization and the blending of beliefs. The image made him think of Bjorn Olavsson, the cursed warrior whose name carried the same root. Perhaps the curse had been a reflection of the nation's inner conflict between the old gods and the new. The monk felt the weight of the mistletoe in his pocket, Ingrid's charm, and smiled faintly. The lesson was unmistakable. Faith didn't need to exclude. Wisdom lived in inclusion and respect for every form of knowledge. The serenity of the morning testified to this understanding. He knew Prior Valerian would not ask questions. To him, the sudden peace in the valley was a sign of divine grace. Alban didn't need recognition. The relief in Brother Elias's voice and the quiet marsh were reward enough. Another historical memory touched him gently, the strictness of medieval monastic custom. Any monk who left the abbey without formal permission was subject to penance. Alban was ready to accept whatever punishment might come, but the prior's silence was its own kind of forgiveness, an acknowledgement that some solutions require unconventional paths. Prior Valerian's story was one of silent authority, knowing that at times the best way to rule was to look the other way, as long as order and peace were restored. The monk climbed the stairs again, this time toward the great library, a place of leather-bound volumes and parchment rolls. The scent of old paper and dust was familiar and comforting, a smell of stability and accumulated wisdom. He brushed his fingers along the spine of an ancient history volume. The dry, rough leather under his touch felt like a bridge to the past. He wondered how the stories of the night would be passed on, not out loud, but in small fragments and subtle hints woven into future texts, preserving both the secret and the peace. Alban's serene contemplation settled on the beauty of his craft, the power of the quill to shape understanding and safeguard stability. He wasn't a warrior, but a guardian of souls, wielding ink and parchment as his weapons. The main library of St. Olav of Fjorden Abbey was a sanctuary of silence and order, a place where light was softened and sound was absorbed. Alban felt immediately at home in its familiar quiet. The scent of old parchment and dust was a fragrance of stability, something he longed for after the turbulence of the night. He moved toward a particular shelf containing treatises on cosmography and natural sciences, compelled by the need to anchor the esoteric experience he had lived in the logic of the written world. He sought that subtle contrast between faith and reason, a balance he now understood more deeply than ever. He pulled out a thick, heavy volume bound in pigskin, an ancient translation of Ptolemy's astronomical texts, annotated by a long-dead German monk. The leather felt cool and uneven beneath his fingers, and the pages were yellowed and brittle. Alban searched for the Book of Stars, the chapter where the constellation of the Great Raven was described. The historical curiosity he sought was a confirmation that the 120-year cycle Ingrid had mentioned was accurate, that her old, whispered wisdom aligned perfectly with scientific calculation. He found the page, illuminated by the pale morning light streaming through the high window, and there it was. The constellation in their northern latitude reached perfect culmination approximately once every 120 years. An exquisite coincidence that aligned the heavens with the valley's old wound. The event was not magical. It was mathematical, a cosmic rhythm that had orchestrated the valley's suffering. A quiet calm softened his face as the last traces of superstition dissolved. Mystery had given way to logic, and both, he realized, had been true all along. Alban ran his finger along the diagram of stars, the faint crackle of parchment, the only sound in the library. Bjorn Olavsson's curse had, in fact, been a loop in time, an opening created by astronomical precision. The miracle of repetition was simply a doorway aligned by the heavens. This understanding meant the Abbey must change how it recorded such events, not as vague legends, but as recurring phenomena shaped by the sky itself. He closed the cosmography book and returned it to the shelf, feeling the smooth grain of the solid wood, a small act of closure. The human story was complete. The union of knowledge from the book and wisdom from the land had healed the valley. Now it was time to return to his central calling, copying and preserving sacred knowledge. Alban descended to the scriptorium and picked up his quill again. The familiar scent of ink and parchment was his anchor. He returned to the homilies of St. Gregory, but his mind no longer lingered in abstract theology. Instead, it rested on the practical application of faith, service, and compassion for lost souls, both living and dead. He began copying the sacred words with a new reverence and a calmer, deeper rhythm, turning the act of writing into a meditation. The soft, steady sound of his quill gliding over the parchment became his prayer, a continuous whisper blending with the low murmur of the abbey around him. A historical note floated through his mind. Medieval scribes were often bound by strict rules of silence and concentration. Many scriptoria developed hand-sign languages so that scribes could request materials without disrupting the sacred quiet, a discipline Alban now appreciated more than ever. He felt the warmth of the sun growing inside the scriptorium, a gentle heat spreading across his back. The smell of fresh bread drifted in from the kitchen, and the peaceful light settled his spirit. The serenity of that morning felt like a gift after the night's tension. He knew the story of the night would remain his secret. He wouldn't tell anyone, but it would live quietly in his script, in his margins, in the depth of his renewed faith. His union with Ingrid had taught him that truth was often subtle and required discretion. He focused on the shape of each letter, the beauty of the unkiled script he had mastered. Every stroke was an act of devotion, a small fight against forgetfulness and ignorance. The monk felt that his work, though humble, was essential to the preservation of civilization. A serene reflection settled over him. The abbey, though secluded, was deeply tied to the world outside. They were the heart of memory and knowledge, the anchor in a world of instability and fear. He thought briefly of Bjorn Olafsson. The warrior's story was now one of redemption rather than tragedy. He had become proof that even the oldest wounds could be healed through cooperation and understanding. The abbey's bell rang again, marking another hour, a reminder of the rhythm of time, a gentle contrast to the trapped, cyclical time he and Ingrid had broken. Abbey time moved forward toward eternity. He brushed his hand lightly over the parchment, feeling its smooth surface, a perfect canvas for sacred words. He was grateful for the quality of the materials, knowing that producing good parchment required long, careful labor. In that moment, the human story unfolding was one of restored peace, reflected in the quiet of the scriptorium and the steadiness of his own handwriting. Alban had returned to his place, but his spirit had grown far beyond it. He paused, touching the mistletoe in his pocket. Its soft texture reminded him of the world beyond the abbey walls and Ingrid's enduring wisdom. He felt a dual sense of belonging, to the abbey and to the valley. Another historical memory surfaced. To prevent errors and combat monotony, medieval scribes often worked in pairs, one dictating, the other copying, creating a built-in system of revision and accuracy. Copying was, in its own way, a communal act. Alban continued his work, his quill moving gently and steadily, the rhythm of order and faith. The serenity of the morning shielded him from any lingering unease. The contrast between the fragility of parchment and the permanence of the written word felt like a soft, poetic truth that filled him with quiet satisfaction. God's word and human history rested safely beneath his hand. He knew the valley of Velven would flourish now, free from the curse, and that was the greatest prayer he could offer. His work as a scribe had taken on a new dimension. He was now a guardian of peace. The faint scent of ink rising from the page was, to him, the fragrance of truth. He was exactly where he needed to be, fulfilling his duty with the deepest devotion. Morning light kept stretching over the valley while Alban continued his copying, yet his mind drifted toward a more intimate reflection on something he often overlooked in his daily routine: the parchment itself. The feel of the material, animal skin stretched and polished, was smooth and cool, but under the tip of his quill it became a stage for history and faith. He could still smell its faint animal scent, a reminder of its origin, forming a quiet contrast with the metallic tang of iron gall ink. Together, they created a gentle duality of nature and craft in his work. He focused on a small gesture, one he repeated hundreds of times a day, scraping the parchment with a thin blade to correct a mistake. The soft, rasping sound of steel on skin was the sound of patience and refinement, a reminder that error was human, but the pursuit of precision was divine. A serene contemplation settled over him, the humility of his craft revealed in every imperfection, gently erased with the care of an artisan. Alban thought about the journey of that parchment, from the life of the animal to his work table. It was the memory of a living being transformed into a vessel for eternal words. A historical curiosity flickered through his mind. In the more advanced medieval scriptoria, parchments were graded by quality. The finest vellum, often made from a stillborn calf, was reserved for the most important texts and for scripture itself, while rougher parchment was used for chronicles and less formal documents, like the one he had used to record the end of the curse. Sunlight streaming through the window cast a translucent glow over the sheet before him. He could see faint pores, subtle veins, scraped nearly invisible, a delicate poetic trace of the life sacrificed so that knowledge might endure. That sight filled him with deep gratitude and a renewed sense of responsibility for the material in his hands. He felt a shift in the air as a younger monk, Brother Theophilus, sat beside him to begin copying papal bulls. The scent of new wax and inexperience surrounded the novice, a quiet contrast to Alban's ink-dry steadiness. The young man's presence was a reminder of continuity, of knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Alban watched Theophilus struggle to hold his goose quill properly. It scratched sharply across the parchment, the sound uneven and awkward, so different from the gentle, rhythmic whisper of his own writing. A wave of patience and empathy rose in him. He remembered his own early days as a novice, how difficult silence and discipline had been to master. He returned his focus to his own parchment. The poetic image before him was the dark, permanent ink flowing from the quill and anchoring itself into the pale surface, a metaphor for the light of faith settling into a world full of shadows. The parchment's warm, yellow-white tone came from countless cycles of washing, stretching, and drying, a quiet alchemy of labor and time. A historical curiosity drifted through his thoughts. The iron gall ink he used was made from ferrous sulfate, tannin extracted from oak galls, and gum arabic. That chemical composition allowed the ink to sink deep into the parchment, ensuring that the writing would last for centuries, a small secret of immortality. He felt the coarse wool of his monastic habit against his skin, its rough texture a familiar companion. That simple garment was a constant reminder of humility and monastic poverty, a striking contrast to the refined material on which he wrote. He noticed an old moisture stain left by Brother Frey in the 11th century on a nearby chronicle. Even the most devoted monks, he reflected, had their moments of imperfection. A serene acceptance washed over him. Flaws were inevitable, but the pursuit of righteousness was always in the present moment. The wind, drifting through the scriptorium windows, carried a soft murmur, a far cry from the fierce howl he had heard at the temple ruins. Now the sound was gentle, harmless, an invitation to peace and inner stillness. He resumed his writing, letting the repetitive motion guide him into a meditative state. He was no longer merely copying, he was absorbing the words, allowing them to become part of his own substance. The human story unfolding at that moment was one of transmission, an unbroken chain of scribes ensuring that the wisdom of one age reached the next. Alban knew he was a vital link in that chain, and the responsibility rested quietly on his shoulders. He thought about the scent of holy water that would be used later during Mass, a clean fragrance of purification. Its sacred aroma contrasted with the earthy scent of parchment, blending spirit and matter in his daily work. A historical memory surfaced about illumination. In scriptoria, light had always been precious, and monks sat in rows near the windows to make the most of daylight. Poor lighting was one reason so many scribes developed eyesight problems early in life. He felt the sun's warmth shift away from his workspace, a gentle sign of time passing, of morning giving way to midday. Abbey time was slow and predictable, a shelter from the rush and uncertainty of the outside world. He touched the smooth surface of the marble paperweight he used, sensing the cool solidity of the stone. The contrast between marble and parchment, between the eternal and the fragile, was united by the written word. A quiet sense of fulfillment settled in him. He had fulfilled a duty greater than the rule. He had brought peace back to the valley, and that act of charity outweighed any mere written task. He allowed himself a brief glance at Brother Theophilus, whose brow was furrowed with concentration. Teaching the art of writing, he knew, was subtle. It demanded patience and the recognition that every student carried their own rhythm. Alban smiled inwardly. Writing was, in itself, a ritual, a form of contemplation that connected him to history and the divine. His sense of belonging was complete. The image before him was his quill, releasing dense black ink, fixing wisdom and history onto the parchment, ensuring that the light of truth would never fade. Alban set his quill down for a moment, resting his palm on the parchment and feeling its quiet texture, an instinctive gesture of care and respect for the material itself. The faint scent of drying ink drifted upward, a subtle aroma of permanence, a promise that the words he copied would outlive him and many centuries more. His eyes moved to the small ceramic inkwell on his desk, its rough, cool surface standing in gentle contrast to the dark, fluid ink inside. A metaphor for how knowledge was held and released. A historical curiosity crossed his mind as he thought about the oils used in the scriptorium. He knew that to protect parchment from moisture and insects, monks sometimes rubbed it with cedar or chamomile oil. This gave the sheets a soft balsamic fragrance and helped preserve the delicate surface of the skin. A quiet wave of appreciation rose in him for the practical wisdom of the scribes who came before him. He glanced over at Brother Theophilus, who was struggling with a mistake in his copy, his brow furrowed in silent frustration. The young monk picked up his blade and, with an impatient motion, scraped too deeply, creating a tiny tear in the parchment. The sharp sound and the tense silence that followed filled the room, a small human story of fallibility. Without speaking, Alban reached for a scrap of discarded parchment. He moistened the little piece with fish glue, a strong, natural adhesive, and gently pressed it over the tear in Theophilus's sheet. The feel of the thin material under his fingertips demanded patience and the acceptance that mistakes were part of learning. In a whisper softened by the discipline of silence, he said, "Parchment is life, brother. It must be treated with respect. A patch isn't a mark of failure. It's a record of perseverance. The life of the abbey goes on, even with its small flaws." The serenity on Alban's face wasn't the calm of a master correcting a pupil, but of someone passing on a way of seeing the world. The young monk looked at Alban with misty gratitude, and the faint scent of incense lingering in the abbey seemed to deepen, a fragrance of forgiveness and acceptance. Alban felt the warmth of Theophilus's relief, a warmth far more satisfying than the sunlight on his back. He returned to his own work, though now his rhythm was even slower and more deliberate, a quiet reflection of his inner calm. He focused on the circular shape of the letter O, drawing it with the precision of a geometer, turning each character into a small act of art. A historical thought drifted in. In many medieval libraries, the most precious manuscripts were chained to the shelves so they couldn't be taken away. It was a paradox, words chained down so that knowledge might remain free. The soft sound of the noontime bells, sext, broke through the stillness, calling him back to the routine of community life. He set down his quill and closed the inkwell, feeling the weight of time and effort in his shoulders. A quiet contemplation settled over him. The abbey's true wealth wasn't found in treasures, but in the continuity of its work, in the patient, steady transmission of knowledge across generations, a legacy of silence and diligence. He rose and walked toward the refectory, feeling the cool stone floor beneath his sandals. The smell of lentils and rye bread hovered in the air, a strong earthy aroma of simple sustenance that stood in contrast to the intellectual richness of the scriptorium. The small human story of that moment was the communal meal, the one time each day when all the monks gathered together, listening to scripture while they ate, turning the meal into an act of devotion and learning. Alban felt the warmth of the refectory, warmth from the hearth and the presence of so many bodies. The contrast between the scriptorium's cold stillness and the dining hall's hum of quiet activity was one of the seasonal rhythms of his life. He took his seat at the long wooden table. The rough texture of the wood beneath his fingers reminded him of the simplicity of their existence. He looked down at his bowl of lentils, its dark, earthy colors reflecting the soil of the valley. Peace from the valley echoed softly inside him. The absence of fear in the air was nourishment far deeper than any bread. His sense of belonging extended not only to the abbey, but to the restored harmony of the land beyond its walls. A historical memory surfaced. On fasting days, medieval monks were strictly forbidden to eat meat. Their meals consisted of grains, vegetables, and, if they were fortunate, fish. Fasting was seen as a path to purifying the soul. The sound of the lector's voice, reading a passage from St. Augustine, became the soundtrack of the meal. The slow, deliberate pacing of the reading forced the monks to eat in silence, absorbing the word along with their food. Alban's thoughts wandered to Ingrid, the healer in her forest hut. He pictured her eating her own simple meal, perhaps a stew of vegetables and mushrooms, alone but at peace. Her human story continued parallel to his, 2 lives of service, bound by different forms of wisdom. A serene understanding washed over him. The abbey and Ingrid's cabin were 2 arms of the same faith, one reaching toward heaven, the other rooted in the earth, both serving the same community in different ways. He inhaled the salty, warm smell of the food, letting the scent anchor him fully in the present moment. The simplicity of his meal was a grounding contrast to the complexity of the mysteries he had unraveled during the night. A faint smile crossed his lips. Peace in the valley was his weregild, the price paid for redemption, and he knew he would carry that memory in every bite of food and every word he copied. His final gesture was to lift his cup of water, feeling the coolness of the drink against his throat, a small act of satisfaction and gratitude. The day moved forward, and the slow rhythm of abbey life continued, its steady pace becoming his most honest form of prayer. When the midday routine of sext came to an end, Alban felt the pull of a task that would take him beyond the narrow limits of the scriptorium and into a broader part of abbey life. connecting his individual work to the collective. He had been assigned to catalogue a new shipment of parchment skins that had arrived from a supplier on the southern coast, a task that demanded touch, sight, and smell all at once. He walked toward the abbey's storage cellar, a cool, shadowed space where the scents of leather, wood, and wool blended into an aroma of quiet industry and trade. The storeroom lay beneath the abbey, and Alban felt the steady, damp chill of the stone floor under his feet, a sharp contrast to the soft warmth of the refectory. He opened the heavy oak door, feeling the roughness of ancient wood beneath his hands. The faint light coming through a small high window was sparse, but enough to reveal the stacked goods inside. The abbey's human story, he thought, was also a story of logistics and economy, an unseen network of organization that sustained intellectual life in such an isolated place. The shipment of parchment was bundled in large sacks of rawhide. Alban opened the first one, and a strong, salty smell of animal skin, still not fully processed, rose sharply into his nose. The texture under his fingers was oily and coarse, forcing him to use linen gloves to handle it. He inspected each piece carefully, searching for tears or imperfections that would make the skin unsuitable for fine writing. A historical curiosity slipped in. Medieval abbeys, especially those in remote regions like Norway, often acted as centers of trade and production. They bought and sold parchment, wax, honey, and wool, and in many cases served as the economic backbone of the surrounding community, ensuring the valley's survival through their transactions. Alban's intellectual work was tied deeply to this economic reality. The sound of wind coming off the fjord was muffled by the thick stone walls, yet he could still hear it, a distant whisper reminding him of the vast world outside. He focused instead on the soft, dry sound parchment made when sliding under his hands, a sound that spoke of purity in its raw form. As he inspected one of the skins, he noticed a small burn mark, an imperfection that meant it couldn't be used for sacred texts. Still, it made him think of Ingrid. Maybe this particular skin could be used for drafts, or even for recording herb recipes, where perfection mattered little. He felt the subtle contrast between the precision demanded by faith and the acceptance of imperfection found in the wisdom of the earth. He let his thoughts drift to the long preparation process, washing, scraping the skin with a curved lunellum blade, then polishing it with pumice to create the smooth surface he loved. A serene contemplation wrapped around him, the kind that came from recognizing the patience and craftsmanship required to turn raw material into a vessel for words. Another historical thought surfaced: the villagers who supplied these skins. Parchment making was an important source of income for local farmers who sold the byproduct of their cattle slaughter to the abbey. The valley's peace and the continuation of livestock was essential to the abbey's cycle of knowledge production. Alban began stacking the highest quality skins on a sturdy oak table, feeling the soft, oily texture as he worked. In the dim light, the sheets almost blended into the room, a quiet sea of white and pale yellow waiting to be transformed into history. He noticed the sweet, clean smell of beeswax nearby, used to seal parchment crates against moisture. That gentle aroma was a pleasant contrast to the stronger, more animal scent of the raw skins, a fragrance of preservation rather than origin. The Wergild came back to him, peace. The continued life of the valley, the cattle, the skins, everything stood as material proof that the curse had been broken. His cataloguing was, in its own way, an economic record of peace. He picked up a small quill dipped in red ink, miniature used for rubrication, and marked the rejected skins with a small cross. The sound of the quill scratching the rough surface was a quiet, decisive sound of judgment. Red ink, normally reserved for titles and capital letters, became a symbol of discard here. The human story of the moment was one of value and worth. Alban, the copyist, held the power to decide which material was worthy of carrying sacred words and which would serve more ordinary purposes, a silent but significant authority. Another curiosity drifted in. By the 13th century, paper had begun making its way into Europe, but most scribes still considered it inferior for permanent documents. Fragile and less durable, it couldn't compete with the strength and longevity of parchment, the preferred vessel for eternal knowledge. Alban felt the warmth of exertion in his arms as he lifted another bundle. The physical work was a welcome contrast to the stillness of the scriptorium, a kind of prayer using the body rather than the mind. From beyond the walls, he could faintly hear the distant rhythm of axes chopping wood, a sound of life and labor. He noticed the rough, unpolished texture of the wooden shelves around him. The contrast between the coarse timber and the delicate parchment skin was striking. It reminded him how simple materials formed the foundation of civilization. A serene thought washed over him. The abbey was a microcosm of the world, where agriculture, trade, craftsmanship, and faith joined into a single purpose, the preservation of order and knowledge. He smiled faintly, thinking of Ingrid. She would use the thickest, toughest scraps to tie bundles of herbs or write her own symbols. Value was a matter of perspective and use, not intrinsic worth. When he finished cataloguing the high-quality skins, he covered them with a large linen cloth to protect them from dust and moisture. The clean, soft smell of linen contrasted gently with the raw scent of leather. He felt the cold of the cellar seeping into his robes, yet an inner warmth, born of satisfaction, kept him steady. Serenity settled over him completely. His thoughts returned to the farmer who had provided the skins, a man whose livelihood depended on the valley's peace. Alban's work, in its deepest sense, served that man and the entire community. The final sound was that of parchment sliding under the linen cover, a soft whisper marking the end of his task. He had completed the cataloguing, securing the raw material for the next generation of scribes. With the parchment catalogued and the finest skins safely covered in the cellar, Alban closed the heavy oak door, feeling the cold solidity of its iron latch under his palm. The click of the lock was a sound of completion, a sharp contrast to the quiet rustle of parchment he had handled minutes before. He climbed the stone steps back toward the light and warmth of the main floor, where the narrative of the day would expand beyond physical tasks and reconnect to the fate of the freed souls. He headed to the chapel just as the bells began tolling for none, the mid-afternoon prayer. The scent of incense was stronger there, blending with the cool smell of stone. The solemn, repetitive waves of Gregorian chant filled the air, an expanding soundscape that lifted personal devotion into collective worship, turning prayer into a communal heartbeat, the essence of monastic life. Standing at the back of the chapel, Alban watched the colored light from the stained glass windows fall across the monks' robes. The sight of the community united in song was a poetic picture of order and faith. He ran his fingers over his rosary, the smooth wooden beads slipping rhythmically between them, a tactile pattern that helped anchor him in prayer and serenity. A historical curiosity drifted into his mind. Medieval chant was monophonic, a single, unbroken melodic line designed to induce meditation and detach the listener from worldly distractions. It was the opposite of the vivid, earthly noises of the valley below. He remembered the distant wailing he'd heard in the swamp, the sound of Bjorn's trapped soul and the souls of his betrayers. Now, the abbey's chant was its counterpart, a sound of release and peace replacing the cries of anguish. The human story woven through this moment was the victory of prayer and pure intention over the remnants of the curse. A deep serenity settled over him as he realized the abbey, in its isolation, was the spiritual anchor of the valley. The monks were intercessors, and their prayers formed an invisible wall of protection against the spiritual and demonic terrors imagined in medieval belief. Alban felt the warmth of bodies around him, the silent energy of community. The scent of burning beeswax drifted from the candles, a sweet, clean fragrance symbolizing light in the midst of ignorance and fear. He closed his eyes and focused on the memory of Bjorn Olafsson. He prayed for the Viking soul, asking that he find his way to Valhalla or paradise, a gentle ecumenical act inspired by what he had learned from Ingrid. Another thought carried him into history. In the 13th century, mendicant orders like the Franciscans and Dominicans were rising in influence, taking faith out of monasteries and into the cities. Alban's abbey was far more reclusive, but his journey into the valley had connected him to that broader spirit of active service. He felt the coarse wool of his habit beneath his hands, a tactile reminder of his vows of poverty and discipline. He was exactly where he belonged, yet his mind had widened, embracing the outside world and the curandera's wisdom. The chant ended with a single resonant Amen, a unified sound that echoed through the chapel. The serenity of prayer restored Alban's inner balance. His mind was clear, his spirit steady. He was ready to return to the scriptorium. As he stepped out of the chapel, he met Brother Gaspar, the abbey's schoolmaster, a man with a white beard and warm eyes. Gaspar congratulated him on the new shipment of parchment, noting that it was excellent material for the younger students. A quiet warmth filled Alban. This was a scholar's version of praise, a small but meaningful recognition. The abbey's human story was also one of education, ensuring that intellectual legacy would never die. He thought of Ingrid again. Her wisdom, though oral, was also a form of teaching. He and Gaspar taught letters, she taught life. Both were essential to the community's well-being. From the open classroom nearby came the scent of chalk and fresh wood, a fragrance of learning and discipline. The soft recitation of the alphabet from young novices drifted into the hallway, a melody of hope. Peace in the valley would allow these children to grow without the old cyclical fear, and the abbey's knowledge could flourish undisturbed. A deep, quiet gratitude swelled within him. A historical note surfaced. Medieval illuminators, monks who decorated manuscripts, were not only artists but also theologians, using gold and bold colors to depict divine glory and make sacred texts more accessible. Alban made his way back to the scriptorium, feeling the familiar coolness of the stone floor and smelling the ink that lingered in the air. He took up his quill once more, letting the steady repetition of writing calm him. He focused on the beauty of the script, the way each letter joined the next, forming words and words formed truth. Writing was his prayer. Serenity settled completely around him. He had fulfilled his duty to God, to the abbey, and to the valley. The afternoon moved gently forward, and Alban felt the need for a contemplative pause, a quiet moment to absorb the valley's new reality. He made his way to the abbey's small cloister, an inner courtyard surrounded by stone arcades, where life slowed to the soft sound of water trickling from the central fountain. The scent of damp grass and fresh, earthy soil, so different from the dry smell of parchment, filled the air, inviting meditation and a momentary release from work. He sat on a cold stone bench, feeling the rough texture beneath his habit. Closing his eyes, he focused on the silence of the place, a silence that wasn't empty, but full of subtle sounds. The whisper of the fountain, the distant croak of a raven perched on the tower, and the faint rustle of his habit at the slightest movement. This living silence was the calm counterpart to the turmoil of the night before. He thought of Ingrid. What might she be doing during her pause? He pictured her in her cabin, grinding herbs in a stone mortar, the rhythmic thud of the pestle becoming a soft, steady heartbeat. Her small human story continued alongside his, a parallel thread of quiet service, two different forms of devotion woven into the same cultural fabric. A historical curiosity drifted into his thoughts. Medieval cloisters were designed to be the heart of monastic life, places for reflection and reading. Walking slowly around the covered walkway was a kind of ambulatory prayer, and the central garden, the hortus conclusus, symbolized paradise, a sanctuary from the disorder of the outside world. He felt the warm touch of the afternoon sun on his head. The air carried a gentle, comforting heat, such a welcome relief from the cold stones of the abbey. He realized that the light and warmth of nature were, to him, direct expressions of divine grace, a lesson his journey with Ingrid had deepened. The scent of wild roses drifting from the garden reached him, sweet and subtle, a contrast to the sharper smells of the scriptorium and the storage cellar. Their fragrance reminded him of creation's fleeting beauty and the passing of time. A serene understanding settled over him. Peace in the valley wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. It allowed life to unfold fully, without the shadow of repeated grief. The silence around him was proof that the ancient story had finally been laid to rest. He lifted his gaze to the sky. Its deep, calm blue was nothing like the threatening, star-filled darkness of the previous night. He thought of the great Raven constellation, now invisible but still present in memory as the cosmic clock behind the mystery. The fountain's murmuring water created a steady, hypnotic rhythm, inviting him into a deeper quiet. He focused on how the sunlight caught the falling droplets, breaking into flashes of soft brightness, a small dance of serenity. Alban reflected on the difference between the wisdom of the land and the wisdom of books. Books had given him the when and the why. Ingrid had shown him the how and the now. Both were essential for any complete understanding. Another historical thought visited him. After meals, monks often devoted a short time to lectio divina, the contemplative reading of sacred texts, before returning to labor, a way of nourishing the soul before nourishing the manuscript. He closed his eyes again, letting the feel of his rosary guide his focus. The rough wooden beads were a physical reminder of devotion and continuity. Peace filled him at the memory of cooperation. The union of formal faith and folk wisdom wasn't a compromise. It was an expansion of truth. The human story was one of overcoming doctrinal barriers in service of the people. A faint sound drifted from the valley, a cowbell, soft and familiar, signaling health and a return to normal life. The cattle were safe again, and the shepherd's heart could rest. Alban rose and began walking slowly around the cloister, feeling the rhythm of his steps on the stone slabs. The repetition became its own form of meditation, allowing thought to flow freely. He pondered the poetic metaphor of light. The scriptorium's light was the light of knowledge, the swamp's eerie glow was the light of mystery, and the warm afternoon sun was the light of peace and revelation. Serenity wrapped around him again as he recognized that life, even in seclusion, was woven from countless interconnections. The abbey depended on the valley. The valley depended on the abbey. He reached out and touched one of the stone columns supporting the arcades. Its tiny imperfections and marks of age spoke of authenticity and endurance. A soft breeze brushed through the cloister, carrying with it what felt like a whisper of gratitude. Alban sensed that the valley itself was giving thanks for its liberation. He stopped by the fountain and breathed in the clean, cool scent of fresh water, a sensory counterpoint to the sun's warmth. Water, he thought, was the element of renewal and purification, essential for all life. In that moment he realized that the night's experience had transformed him into a new kind of scribe, one who wrote not only what he saw on the manuscript, but what he carried in the soul. A gentle smile touched his lips. The pause had been fruitful. Serenity had prepared him for the second half of the day with a renewed mind and a peaceful spirit. With his time of quiet in the cloister complete, Alban felt that the contemplative pause had settled a new anchor of calm within him. He rose, aware of the changing texture of the afternoon air, already growing cooler, a sign that the sun was drifting west. The soft sound of water trickling from the fountain faded behind him, replaced by the more practical, dry sound of his footsteps as he returned to the heart of the abbey to resume his duty. He passed by the kitchen, where the warm, comforting smell of baking bread drifted through the hallway. The aroma of yeast and flour was the scent of sustenance and life, a gentle contrast to the smells of devotion and mystery that had dominated his night and morning. The monk appreciated the simplicity of abbey life, where every scent and sound carried a clear purpose. A serene understanding settled over him. Routine mattered. The discipline of bells, meals, and daily work was the shield that protected the monks from the world's disorder. That predictable rhythm allowed the abbey to remain a repository of knowledge and a pillar of stability for the region. A historical curiosity surfaced in his thoughts. Medieval monastic kitchens were often equipped with large stone ovens and complex storage systems to ensure a steady supply of food through long winters. The meals were simple but plentiful, providing the energy needed for intellectual labor and prayer. Alban returned to the scriptorium, where the afternoon light streamed through the windows in a warm, amber glow across the tables. The familiar scent of iron gall ink and parchment wrapped around him like an old cloak. Brother Theophilus was still at his desk, his quill moving with a steadier, more confident rhythm, a sign that Alban's repair and quiet patience had truly helped. The monk sat at his own desk. He picked up his quill, feeling the smooth, cool shaft of goose feather against his fingers, and dipped it into the dark ink. The soft, rhythmic scratch of his writing became his afternoon prayer, a quiet and steady beat that guided his concentration. He focused on the shape of the letters, on the beauty of uncial script. Writing was his form of contemplation, an act of anchoring divine truth into the physical world. The poetic image before his eyes was the dark ink flowing to create the light of knowledge, a subtle yet powerful contrast. He thought of Ingrid, the healer. He imagined her out in the forest now, gathering roots and herbs under the same afternoon light. Her small human story was one of practical wisdom and deep connection to nature, a form of service every bit as vital as his own. He realized that the abbey and Ingrid's cabin were two worlds that, the night before, had met in perfect harmony. The valley's peace was the fruit of that union, the balance between formal faith and ancestral knowledge. A historical curiosity drew his thoughts to the lives of medieval healers. Often viewed with suspicion by the church, they were nonetheless essential to their communities, mastering herbal medicine and childbirth. Ingrid embodied that resilience and knowledge. Alban felt the afternoon sun shift away from his desk, a gentle reminder of time's slow, inevitable passage. The air was growing cooler, the natural rhythm of the day. He allowed himself a brief glance at the parchment containing the chronicle where he had recorded the end of the curse. The steady, decisive handwriting was the material proof that the repetition had been broken and the cycle of fear brought to an end. A serene sense of responsibility washed over him, A scribe must record not only the deeds of kings and saints, but also the quiet, profound truths that rose from the land and its people. He heard the distant voices of young monks practicing their chanting in the choir, soft, slightly off-key voices shaping themselves into harmony. It was a fragile melody of hope and continuity. Alban wondered how the story of the night would be passed on, not through public preaching, but through small whispers and subtle hints, enough to preserve the peace without reopening the wound of superstition. He felt the mistletoe charm in his pocket, Ingrid's gift. It was a physical reminder of his promise and his connection to the healer, a quiet form of protection. A historical curiosity touched his thoughts. The use of candles and oil lamps in the scriptorium, once daylight, faded. Whale oil and tallow were common, but the danger of fire was constant, making nighttime copying an act of risky devotion. He continued writing, and the rhythm of his quill grew more fluent, more assured, a steady flow that carried him into deep concentration and gentle detachment. A faint smile touched his lips. The abbey's silence wasn't the silence of emptiness, it was the silence of fullness, of peace, of work well done. The poetic image accompanying him was that of dark ink fixing light onto parchment, a metaphor for how truth manifested and endured through quiet, dedicated labor. He felt the weight of the parchment beneath his hand, the weight of history and responsibility. Serenity wrapped around him completely, and the valley slept peacefully. As the late afternoon settled in, and the scriptorium slipped into its colder hour, Alban felt the need for a new perspective to keep his mind clear. He sought a shift in focus towards someone he rarely paid attention to, Brother Rue, the abbey's maker of candles and lamps. Setting his quill aside, he walked quietly toward Rue's workshop, a small annex heavy with the strong smell of mutton tallow and beeswax, a scent of manual labor and fire. The workshop sat near the kitchen, and Alban felt the warmth of the stove spilling out, sharply contrasting with the chill that had settled over the rest of the abbey. When he stepped inside, he found Brother Rue, an elderly man with a round, cheerful face, immersed in his craft. Rue was dipping wicks into a large pot of melted tallow, performing the slow, repetitive movement that turned raw material into sources of light. A new focus in the quiet human story of warmth and illumination. The sounds in the workshop were soft but steady, the faint bubbling of hot tallow, the dry rhythmic snip of wicks being trimmed, and the discreet crackle of the fire beneath the pot. The air felt warm and slightly greasy, a tactile reminder of the contrast between this room and the scriptorium's cold austerity. Alban watched the flickering lamplight dance across the stone walls, casting long, fantastic shadows, a visual rhythm of labor and dedication. A historical curiosity surfaced in his mind. Medieval lighting was no trivial matter. Candles made from tallow, animal fat, were common, smoky and pungent. Wealthier abbeys used beeswax, which burned cleaner and brighter, but was far more expensive. Light was precious, costly and fragile, which meant most intellectual labor happened during daylight hours. Rue's work, therefore, was nothing short of vital. Alban stepped closer, quietly observing as Brother Rue lifted the wicks from the pot and hung them on a circular rack, letting them cool and harden. The motion was deliberate, patient, and filled with practical wisdom. Alban felt the heat radiating from the molten tallow, a warmth that sustained life and knowledge in the darkness. Brother Rue wasn't surprised to see him. He simply smiled and offered Alban a small beeswax candle that had just cooled. The candle felt smooth and slightly scented, a stark contrast to the oily texture of tallow. The sweet, clean fragrance of beeswax rose gently, blending with the workshop's heavier aromas. Alban accepted it, sensing the cool firmness of the wax and the quiet promise of light it contained. Light, he thought, was one of the most perfect metaphors for faith in the Middle Ages, a small flame fighting back the vast darkness of the world and its ignorance. A serene understanding washed over him the importance of humble tasks. He remembered the eerie blue light he had seen in the marsh, the spectral glow of the curse. Rue's fire was different. This was the fire of order, usefulness, and life. The contrast between the cursed light and the abbey's light revealed a new perspective on the medieval duality between chaos and order. His thoughts wandered to another curiosity: Ingrid's world. She used oil lamps fueled by fish or whale oil, cheaper, stronger, practical, but smoky and pungent. Her illumination was functional, tied to the earth and the coast. The abbey's light was refined, almost symbolic. The bubbling of the tallow grew louder, a soft, constant murmur that invited reflection. Alban realized that every candle Rue produced held its own small human story: the animal that provided the fat, the craftsman who shaped it, and the monk who would later use it to read or write in the dark. He watched as Rue smoothed the surface of a candle with a strip of linen, ensuring an even, clean burn. Even this small gesture was a kind of prayer, precision as devotion, craftsmanship as service. He thought of how lamplight had guided his hand while copying the chronicles, and how without Rue the abbey's knowledge could not be preserved through the night. Rue's trade was the invisible foundation of all intellectual work. A quiet contemplation settled over him. The monastic community was a living organism. Every role, the scribe, the gardener, the candlemaker, was essential for survival and for fulfilling their collective purpose. He noticed that the slow, repetitive rhythm of Rue's work carried a calmness of its own, a meditative cadence that contrasted with the restlessness of the valley's recent turmoil. The soft, steady sounds became a kind of serenity. Heat from the furnace warmed Alban's face, a warmth that made him feel present and alive. And then he heard it. The distant bells of Vespers, ready to call the monks into the evening prayer. He nodded in farewell. Rue touched the candle with the tip of his finger, a silent blessing. Alban left the workshop carrying the beeswax candle, feeling as though he held a small piece of light within his spirit. Another historical curiosity came to mind: the use of water clocks and hourglasses in medieval abbeys. These instruments helped mark the hours of prayer and labor in a world without precise mechanical clocks. As he walked toward the chapel, the smell of tallow and beeswax clung faintly to his clothes, a physical reminder of his visit and of the importance of manual work. His thoughts drifted to Ingrid again. She kept time through the stars and the sun. Abbey time was disciplined and mechanical. Her time was natural and cyclical. The bells of Vespers began to toll, their deep, resonant sound filling the air and calling him back to devotion. A serene realization settled over him once more. The abbey was the valley's lighthouse. He stepped into the chapel, the cool stone beneath his feet grounding him. The evening light filtered through the stained glass, painting the room in soft, ethereal colors. He placed the beeswax candle onto a candelabrum, a small offering of gratitude for Rue's work and for the light of knowledge. Serenity descended fully. The candle's flame was his new perspective, a small, steady light of service and humility that replaced the ghostly glow of the curse. The chapel of St. Olav of Fjorden was filled with the deep, solemn sound of Vespers, the communal chant that marked sunset and the close of the working day. Alban, standing quietly at the back, felt the cold breath of the stone walls and the strong scent of incense and burnt wax, a fragrance of devotion that wrapped around him and contrasted sharply with the heavier smell of tallow lingering from Rue's workshop. He had brought with him the light of humility, the candle that symbolized the wisdom found in simple tasks. He closed his eyes and joined the chant, letting the familiar Latin of the Gregorian melody flow gently from his lips. The voices, united and steady, formed a kind of meditation, a rhythmic repetition that helped him loosen the last threads of unease left from the night before. A serene sense of contemplation washed over him as he realized how the collective strength of their voices created something purifying, something far more powerful than any solitary sound. His thoughts drifted to the poetic metaphor of fire. Rux's tallow flames, the small lamps in the scriptorium, and the candle burning on the altar, all were sources of warmth and light that stood in stark contrast to the cold, ghostly lights that had trapped Bjorn Olafsson's soul in the marsh. The abbey's light was the light of order and redemption. A historical curiosity rose in his mind. Medieval bells were not merely calls to prayer. They marked the passing of time, announced important events, and, in moments of danger, warned the entire community. A bell was the abbey's voice, the sound that governed life in the valley. Alban felt the texture of the cold stone floor beneath his shoes, anchoring him to the present moment. He remembered the rough earth at the ruins of the pagan temple and the soft sprig of mistletoe in his pocket. The contrast between these materials mirrored the union of two worlds inside him. His gaze shifted to Prior Valerian, standing tall in the choir. The prior embodied discipline and authority, a small human story of leadership in an uncertain world. Alban knew that his own secret act of service had been necessary, but he also understood that the abbey's order must be respected. Vespers ended with the Magnificat, Mary's song, its melody carrying gratitude and hope. A warm, quiet relief filled the chapel, a gentle wave of serenity preparing him for the night ahead. He thought of Ingrid, who would be marking her own sunset in her own way, perhaps through a small ritual of herbs and fire in her cabin. Their parallel perspectives had taught him something important. Faith had many faces, but a single purpose: the search for peace and truth. A historical reminder drifted through him. Medieval abbeys were centers of hospitality. They were often the only safe places for travelers and pilgrims, offering food, shelter, and protection in an age when roads were perilous. Alban rose and walked slowly out of the chapel, still surrounded by the sweet smoke of incense clinging faintly to his robes. His footsteps were softened by the gentle murmur of monks moving together. He touched the worn wood of the chapel door, smoothed and carved by centuries of hands. Its texture reminded him of continuity and of the abbey's unbroken stability. He made his way to the refectory for supper, the day's final meal, greeted by the strong aroma of dried fish and boiled vegetables. The food was simple but nourishing, enough to sustain them through the night's prayers. He took his place at the long table, feeling the familiar rough wood beneath his fingers. When he looked at the dark, dense rye bread, his mind returned to Bjorn Olafsson, the bread of peace offered through his liberation. The only permitted sound during the meal was the reader's voice, reciting the lives of the Desert Fathers. The slow, uplifting rhythm of the reading created an atmosphere of reflection and discipline. A serene understanding filled Alban. His life, though humble, was rich in purpose. The valley's restored peace was his greatest reward, the quiet proof that his work mattered. He recalled another small social curiosity, the silent language of monastic meals. Codified gestures allowed the monks to ask for salt, water, or bread, preserving silence and concentration even in practical needs. Alban ate slowly, savoring the simplicity of the food. The warm air of the refectory wrapped around him, a soothing contrast to the cold settling outside. His thoughts turned again to Bjorn Olafsson, the warrior whose soul had finally found rest. The monk felt he had carried out a true act of spiritual charity. When the abbey bell rang for Compline, the final prayer of the day, it called him back to the chapel. The work of the day was done. He rose and walked with the other monks. The scent of incense in the hallway had softened, and the candlelight cast a gentle, ethereal glow along the walls. His body felt tired, yet his spirit was light. Peace rested fully upon him. He entered the chapel and took his seat. The chant of Compline rose, deep, soft and steady, a hymn that seemed to cradle the night itself. And through it all, one poetic image remained with him, his small beeswax candle burning quietly on the altar, the light of humility and service shining softly into the darkness. Night deepened, and Alban was back in his cubiculum, the small monastic cell, feeling a growing need to sharpen his senses just enough to register the valley's new quiet. He lay down on his hard wooden cot, noticing the roughness of the straw mattress beneath him and the gentle scent of clean linen stretched across the bed. He focused on the subtle sounds and faint movements that drifted through the darkness, searching for a contrast to the noise of suffering that had once weighed so heavily over the valley. The prevailing sound was the abbey's silence. But unlike the tense, expectant silence of the days before, this one was filled with peace. Even so, he could still hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of the monks resting in the cells nearby, a small chorus of life and sleep blending with the distant wind blowing in from the fjord, a constant and harmless murmur. His thoughts drifted to Ingrid, the healer. He pictured her in her cabin, sleeping deeply now, unburdened by the curse. The quiet little human story of the healer at rest was the final proof that the ritual had worked. The absence of unrest was his greatest reward. A familiar historical curiosity rose in him. In medieval monasteries, monks often slept fully dressed, in their habits and shoes, ready for the call of matins in the middle of the night. Sleep was seen not as a pleasure, but as a functional rest, to be kept brief and disciplined. Alban felt the cool night air seeping through the small window opening. The cold was steady, but his habit and the thick wool blanket kept him warm. The contrast between the chill outside and the heat of his own body reminded him of life's fragility and of the simple gift of shelter. He noticed the lingering scent of beeswax still clinging to his robes, a sweet, clean fragrance mingling with the smell of stone and damp air. It felt like a sensory charm, an anchor to the memory of that night of liberation and teamwork. The monk rose from his cot and walked to the small window. He looked out at the valley, now completely swallowed by darkness. It was pitch black, but no fear stirred in him. The darkness felt clean, free of the eerie blue lights that had once haunted it. He remembered a curious practice among medieval illuminators. They kept their precious pigments locked away in small chests, safe from moisture and theft. Protecting materials was a reflection of protecting the written word, protecting knowledge itself. Alban slipped a hand into his pocket and touched the sprig of mistletoe Ingrid had given him. He held it for a moment, feeling its soft, velvety surface, an unspoken connection to the healer and to the wisdom that grew from the earth. He focused on the distant sound of dogs barking in the village of Velven. Their calls were calm and steady now, protective, grounded, so different from the frantic, terrified barking that had spread through the valley while the curse was active. A gentle wave of serene reflection passed through him. True peace, he realized, wasn't just the absence of danger, but the restoration of the natural order. The valley's silence was living proof that an ancient story had finally been resolved. His thoughts turned to Bjorn Olafsson. The warrior's soul was free now, walking its final path. Alban felt he had fulfilled an act of charity that reached far beyond the borders of his own faith. The small human story of that moment was one of quiet vigilance, the monk alone in his cell, watching over the peace he had helped restore. He was the sentry of a new order. Another historical thought drifted across his mind. this one about the pens used by medieval scribes. Goose and swan feathers were carefully prepared so the ink would flow smoothly, an art that required patience and precision. He returned to his cot. The scratchy straw beneath him felt rough, but strangely comforting. He pulled the wool blanket over himself, feeling its warmth spread slowly through his body. He let the scent of clean linen and warm wool fill his senses, a simple, honest fragrance that stood in peaceful contrast to the smells of fear and mystery that had filled the previous night. He listened to the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat, a calm, living pulse that echoed the valley's restored order. He reflected on life's brevity and the endurance of the written word. A serene understanding settled over him. His life, though cloistered, was not one of isolation. It was a life of service, deeply rooted in the fate of the community he served. He allowed himself a brief moment of gratitude for Ingrid's courage, for the wisdom of ancient monks, and for the peace that had finally returned. Alban closed his eyes. Serenity was complete. He was ready for sleep, with a clear mind and a resting spirit. In the deep silence of the cubiculum, Alban felt time calling to him, not the time marked by the bells of the canonical hours, but the quiet inner call that came just before matins, the middle of the night prayer. He rose, feeling the rough texture of the straw beneath his mattress, a physical reminder of monastic discipline. The night was bitterly cold, and he could sense the chill in the air drifting through his cell, yet the inner warmth of his peaceful soul kept him steady. He dressed in his habit and shoes, a custom that allowed the monks to be ready for the night office at any moment. The sound of his movements was soft and discreet, a muted whisper that blended naturally with the stillness of the abbey. He focused on the faint scent of beeswax coming from his pocket, Ingrid's amulet, its sweet, subtle aroma contrasting with the cold smell of stone and moisture around him. A gentle historical curiosity carried him back to the importance of matins in medieval abbeys. It was the longest and most demanding of all the offices, performed in the darkness of night, usually between 2 and 3 in the morning, a vigil of patience and penance symbolizing the wait for Christ's return and ensuring the monks were always prepared. Alban stepped out of his cell, and the sound of his footsteps on the stone slabs became the only noise in the corridor's darkness. The whale oil lamps Brother Rue had provided burned weakly, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls, an ethereal glow that guided the monks toward the chapel. He met Brother Theophilus, the novice, walking quickly and a bit unsteadily, his head bowed in humility. The novice's small human story was one of perseverance, fighting against sleep and cold to fulfill his duty. Alban touched his shoulder lightly, a silent gesture of encouragement and solidarity. The cold from the corridor seeped into Alban's body, but he focused on the inner warmth of his faith, the feel of the cold stone under his fingers as he steadied himself against the wall, stood in contrast to the spiritual warmth promised inside the chapel. When they entered, the bell began to toll, a deep resonant sound that filled the air and stirred the valley awake. Candlelight cast a soft, otherworldly glow across the altar, a small circle of light amid the vast darkness of night. A serene contemplation settled over him. The abbey was the valley's lighthouse, and its night prayers were the fuel that kept that light burning, pushing back the shadows of ignorance and fear that the curse had briefly revived. He remembered a small detail about monastic architecture. Medieval chapels were often built with excellent acoustics, designed to amplify the sound of Gregorian chant and turn the human voice into an instrument of praise and meditation. Alban took his place on the bench. Matins began, a gentle, deep chorus of voices blending seamlessly with the silence of night. The rhythmic repetition of the Latin verses felt hypnotic, inviting release and steady concentration. He closed his eyes and thought of Ingrid, the healer, likely sleeping safely now. He felt that his prayer was also a prayer for her, a quiet blessing for her wisdom and courage. Through the chapel walls, he could hear the sound of the wind moving across the fjord, a distant murmur mixing with the monks' chant. The sound was harmless now, the calm melody of nature at rest. Another historical curiosity came to mind: medieval psalters, the books of psalms used by monks during the offices. Many were beautifully illuminated to help them memorize the Latin text and stay focused through the long hours of prayer. Alban felt the full serenity of the place. The peace he had helped restore now lived in the valley's stillness and in the abbey's order. His work as a scribe carried new meaning, one of service and quiet charity. He focused on the scent of incense growing stronger as the candles warmed the air, a fragrance of devotion and purity. The abbey felt cleansed of fear and sorrow. Opening his eyes, he looked at the beeswax candle he had placed on the altar. Its soft, steady flame symbolized humility, Rue's craftsmanship, and the light Alban had found beyond the abbey walls. He reflected on the poetic metaphor of darkness. The night wasn't the enemy. It was the backdrop against which the light of faith and knowledge could shine most clearly. Darkness was the womb of revelation. The small human story of that moment was one of silent vigilance, the monk in prayer, guarding the newly won peace of the valley against any return of disorder. He remembered another curious medieval custom. Monks often slept with a small piece of wood or a crucifix beneath their pillow to ward off nightmares and demonic temptations, a subtle, physical protection. The chant of matins slowly shifted, moving toward Lauds, the office that welcomed the coming dawn. The rhythm of prayer was the rhythm of life. Alban felt the warmth of his body and the cold of the stone beneath him. He stood balanced between matter and spirit, darkness and light. Serenity washed over him. His life was one of service, and his reward was the valley's peace and the bright, steady light of knowledge. And the image that lingered with him was that of his prayer, rising gently through the silence of the night, a soft murmur of gratitude and hope. With matins completed and the abbey settling once more into a quiet rest before Lauds, Alban sensed a slow shift in the atmosphere. The air, heavy and cold just moments earlier, was beginning to feel lighter, announcing the transition from night to dawn. He remained in his cell, watching the small window opening gradually brighten, the total darkness giving way to a soft grey, and he breathed in the scent of dew and cold earth drifting inside, an aroma of renewal and fresh beginnings. He focused on the gentle repetition of the words he had copied the day before, St. Gregory's homilies, letting the rhythm of the Latin move quietly through his mind. The monk realized that the subtle contrast between the retreating darkness and the advancing light mirrored his own experience. The light of knowledge and peace had finally dispelled the ancestral curse's shadow. A familiar historical curiosity carried him back to the Horai Canonici, the monk's cycle of prayer. The time between matins and lauds was a period of deep silence known as the vigil's interval, when monks could meditate or resume intellectual work, a golden moment for contemplation and stillness before the formal day began. Alban thought of Ingrid, the healer. He pictured her waking in her cabin, feeling the same cool air and seeing the same gentle light. He could almost smell the fresh herbs she would soon begin to grind for her morning salves. Her small human story was one of wisdom renewed with the rising sun. He touched the sprig of mistletoe in his pocket, Ingrid's amulet, feeling its soft, velvety texture, and he smiled. The mistletoe was a physical reminder that the knowledge of the earth and the abbey's faith were two sides of the same coin, both essential for the valley's health and peace. The wind from the fjord drifted softly through the window, now reduced to a gentle melancholic murmur, a stark contrast to the howls of the previous night. The sound was harmless, the melody of a valley at rest. Alban felt as though the wind itself were singing a hymn of deliverance. Another historical thought came to him, the cold endured by medieval scribes. In the harsh Scandinavian winter, monks often wore fingerless gloves while copying manuscripts to shield their hands from the chill of the stone and the parchment, ensuring their writing remained precise and steady. The monk rose and walked to the window. The light had become a pale grey, and he could now make out the outlines of mountains and trees. The visual contrast was soft, the night fading slowly and calmly, a natural invitation to serenity. He repeated in his mind the sentence he had written in the chronicle, "The cycle of the punished deceived was broken forever." The quiet, inward repetition of the words became a gentle mantra of peace and redemption. A serene contemplation settled over him. True faith was active, seeking truth and charity beyond the boundaries of dogma. His journey with Ingrid had taught him that wisdom lived in the union of opposites. Alban thought of Bjorn Olafsson, the warrior. He imagined his soul sailing toward rest, freed from the agony of betrayal. The poetic metaphor of that voyage brought Alban a deep sense of comfort. The first bell began to ring, the tower bell, announcing the start of Lord's and the sun's imminent arrival. The sound was deep and resonant, a call to gratitude for the new light. He smelled the strong scent of pine smoke rising from the chimneys of Velven village. The smell was a sign of life and activity, a contrast to the silence and mystery of the previous night. A historical curiosity surfaced, the daily rhythm of medieval peasants. Their day began at dawn, and fires were lit to warm the porridge and bake the bread, an unbroken cycle of work and sustenance that the abbey quietly supported. The monk dressed and stepped out of his cell, feeling the chill of the stone slabs under his feet. The corridor was brighter now, and the shadows shorter. He met Brother Theophilus, who walked with steady, confident steps. The novice had overcome the night's exhaustion and was ready for the new day, a quiet human story of perseverance and discipline. A serene contemplation embraced Alban. The peace in the valley was the most precious gift the abbey could offer the community. The absence of fear was true wealth. He thought of the warmth of the rising sun. That warmth would contrast with the night's cold, a promise of comfort and renewal. The monk smiled softly. His life of seclusion was, at its core, a life of service, and his reward was the valley's tranquility. He entered the chapel. The chant of Lauds began, a gentle, hopeful chorus welcoming the new light. His prayer rose with it, blending with the birdsong outside, a quiet union of faith and nature. In the abbey's chapel, the sound of the Lord's chant rose gently, celebrating the birth of the sun. Standing within the choir, Alban felt the slow shift in the light filtering through the stained glass windows, a soft play of colors gliding across the stone floor. The scent of incense lingered in the air, blending with the crisp fragrance of early morning, shaping an atmosphere of deep devotion. He felt the cold stone beneath his feet and the warmth of his praying body, a quiet contrast that anchored him in the present. He focused on the figure of Christ depicted in the stained glass, the colors growing richer as the sun climbed. The light was a symbol of redemption and knowledge, a visual metaphor standing in stark contrast to the night's darkness and the shadow of the curse. A serene contemplation settled over him. The abbey was the beacon guiding souls toward the light. The chant ended with the Benedictus, the canticle of Zechariah, a melody of hope and gratitude. Alban felt the relief and peace spreading through the chapel, a sign that fear and unrest had been washed away by sunrise. The serenity of that morning was a gift. He thought of Ingrid, the healer. He pictured her in her cabin, lighting her fire and preparing her morning tea, surrounded by the soft scent of fresh herbs. Her small human story was one of wisdom renewed with the dawn, a parallel view of the world just as valid as his own. A historical curiosity carried him back to medieval herbals. Monks, much like healers, were often among the few who kept medicinal gardens, and their knowledge of botany and healing was essential to the community's well-being, a subtle connection to Ingrid's work. Alban rose and walked slowly out of the chapel, feeling the cold texture of the stone slabs beneath his shoes. The incense scent had faded, and he could now hear the gentle song of birds outside, a melody of life and renewal. He made his way to the scriptorium for prime, the first hour of prayer and the official beginning of the day's work. Natural light filled the room, eliminating the need for ruse oil lamps, a welcome and gradual shift in illumination. He sat at his desk, the familiar scent of iron gall ink and parchment wrapped around him like a quiet welcome. He picked up his quill and resumed copying the homilies, falling into the slow, steady rhythm of his work. Repetition was his form of meditation. A serene contemplation settled over him. Peace in the valley was his Vergild, the price paid for redemption. He had fulfilled his duty to God and to the community, and his work as a scribe now carried a new meaning, an act of active service. He recalled a historical curiosity about medieval locks. The abbey's most valuable manuscripts, relics and treasures were stored in locked chests and cabinets, symbolizing protection against disorder and theft. The monk focused on the shape of each letter, on the beauty of unsealed script. Writing was his form of prayer, a way of fixing the divine word into the material world. The poetic image before his eyes was the dark ink flowing to create light. He thought of Bjorn Olafsson, the warrior. His soul was free now, and his torment had ended. Alban felt he had performed an act of spiritual charity, and the valley's peace was his proof. The sound of Brother Theophilus working diligently beside him was a quiet reminder of perseverance and discipline. The novice's small human story was one of knowledge being passed down, of an ancient craft continuing onward. Warm sunlight slipped through the window and touched the parchment surface. The heat was a soft contrast to the cool stone, a gentle promise of comfort and renewal. He remembered a curious medieval custom. Finishers, the monks who reviewed manuscripts, often wrote a small prayer at the end of the text, asking forgiveness for any copying errors. It was an act of humility, a recognition of human fallibility. Alban smiled faintly. He didn't need to write a prayer for forgiveness. His prayer had been the night's actions. He had corrected a mistake that had lasted for centuries. A serene contemplation surrounded him. Life in the abbey, though simple, was rich in purpose and meaning. Peace in the valley was his legacy. He felt the mistletoe in his pocket, Ingrid's amulet, and held it for a moment, feeling its velvety texture. It was a physical reminder of his connection to the earth. The abbey bell rang again, announcing a new hour, a rhythm of order and faith. The monk was exactly where he needed to be, fulfilling his duty with deep devotion. He focused on the scent of ink rising to his nose, the aroma of truth and knowledge. Serenity was complete, and the valley rested in peace. The poetic image that stayed with him was that of his quill, the scribe's tool, fixing light onto the parchment, ensuring the truth would not fade. The workday was drawing to a close, and Alban felt a gentle sense of quiet settling over the abbey, a soft preparation for the end of the day and the stillness of night. He rose from his desk in the scriptorium, feeling the need to revisit both the fruit of his labor and the memory of the night before. The scent of wax and ink had begun to blend with the cool smell of stone, a sign that natural light was fading and Rue's lamps would soon be lit. The monk walked toward the shelf of chronicles, feeling the cool touch of the leather-bound volumes. He pulled out the 13th century chronicle that recorded the curse and its release, a silent and enduring witness to what had happened. Seeing his own handwriting, steady and clear, on the last page, reminded him of the power of the written word and of truth. He focused on the sentence he had written, revisiting the scene of the liberation in his mind. The cycle of the punishment of the deceived was broken forever. Repeating those words inwardly helped seal the moment, ensuring that peace wasn't an illusion, but a new reality. A historical curiosity carried him to the medieval Analecta. Besides official chronicles, many monasteries kept annals, yearly records of local events. Alban's entry in the official chronicle marked the event's importance, raising the breaking of the curse from legend to historical fact. The monk remembered the mistletoe in his pocket, Ingrid's amulet. Its soft, velvety texture was a physical reminder of his bond with the healer. He thought about how Ingrid's wisdom had been the key that allowed him, a man of books, to unravel the mystery that Latin alone couldn't explain. He caught the salty, powerful scent of the fjord, drifting in through the scriptorium windows, a smell of vastness and freedom, contrasting with the enclosed calm of the abbey. The wind outside was only a faint, harmless murmur now, the quiet melody of nature at rest. A serene contemplation settled over him. The abbey, in all its seclusion, was the meeting point between human knowledge and divine mystery. The valley's peace was the fruit of that union, the balance between rule and freedom. He thought again of Bjorn Olafsson, the warrior. His story was that of a man redeemed through the cooperation of two worlds. The poetic metaphor of a soul sailing toward rest brought comfort to Alban. The sound of Brother Rue lighting the lamps in the hallway drifted into the room, a soft whisper of light. The scent of tallow and beeswax spread through the air, an aroma of service and perseverance. The artificial glow was a reminder that the abbey's work continued even in darkness. A historical curiosity brought him to the medieval exemplaria. To prevent copying errors, scriptoria often kept one carefully reviewed master manuscript. Their devotion to accuracy was a form of worship, a commitment to truth. Alban rested his hand on the wall, feeling the cold, rough stone. Its texture reminded him of the abbey's permanence amid the impermanence of human life. He thought of Brother Theophilus, the novice, folding his parchments with growing confidence. The novice's small human story was one of perseverance and learning, a sign that tradition would endure. The monk smiled softly. The silence of the scriptorium wasn't empty. It was full of meaning, work, and peace. He was ready for the day to end. A gentle contemplation settled over him. His life, though simple, was rich in purpose and meaning. The valley's peace was his legacy, the proof that his work mattered. He imagined the warmth of the fireplace that would soon be lit in the refectory for supper. Its heat would be a gentle contrast to the night's chill, a promise of comfort and community. The abbey bell rang for vespers, pulling him back toward the chapel. The sound was deep and solemn, the rhythm of order and faith. He rose and walked toward the chapel. The scent of incense grew stronger, carrying devotion and purity through the air. The monk felt the weight of his tired body, yet his spirit was light and peaceful. Serenity was complete. He entered the chapel and took his seat. The Vespers chant began, a gentle, resonant chorus, inviting the soul to rest. The image that stayed with him was that of his quill, the one that had written the story of liberation, and the abbey bell that proclaimed peace. With Vespers finished, Alban stepped out of the chapel and felt the night air, already cold and dry, settling over the abbey. He made his way to the refectory for supper, the final gathering of the day, feeling the weight of his tired body but the lightness of his spirit. The smell of burning firewood, along with the simple aroma of boiled cabbage and rye bread, filled the corridor, a gentle contrast to the incense and devotion of the chapel. He could sense the chill settling outside and the warmth waiting in the refectory, a welcome comfort. He sat at the long table, feeling the rough wooden surface beneath his hands. The sound of the reader reciting the Rule of St. Benedict was the quiet soundtrack of the meal, a steady, muted murmur guiding discipline and silence. A serene contemplation surrounded him. The abbey's routine was the anchor that kept peace and order in place, the necessary counterweight to the disorder of the outside world. Alban looked down at the dark rye bread before him, letting his thoughts drift to one last historical curiosity about food. Bread was sacred in the Middle Ages, the basic, essential nourishment of both monks and peasants. Sharing bread symbolized communion, and it formed the backbone of monastic diet. The valley's restored health, free from the curse, ensured the abbey's bread. He ate slowly, absorbing the warmth and sustenance of the simple meal. His thoughts wandered to Ingrid, the healer. He imagined her having supper alone in her cabin, perhaps a vegetable stew made from herbs gathered in the forest. Her small human story was that of a guardian of natural wisdom, sustained by the generosity of the earth. The monk felt the mistletoe in his pocket, Ingrid's amulet. He held it gently, sensing its soft texture, a reminder of his promise to honor the truth he had found beyond the abbey walls. His connection to the outside world was now an essential part of his faith. The reader's voice faded, and Prior Valerian gave the final blessing, signaling that supper had ended. Alban rose and joined the other monks as they walked toward the chapel for Compline, the last prayer of the day. The silence that followed the meal was a silence of recollection and preparation for night. He stepped into the chapel. The scent of incense had softened, and the candlelight was the only illumination, spreading a delicate, ethereal glow. The chant of Compline began, a gentle, resonant chorus inviting the soul toward restful sleep. A serene contemplation settled over him. Though his life was devoted to seclusion, it was deeply active in service. His journey with Ingrid had taught him that charity appeared in many forms, and the valley's restored peace was the proof. He remembered Bjorn Olafsson, the warrior. His soul was at peace now. His torment had ended. Alban felt he had performed an act of spiritual charity that transcended dogma. The sound of Telusius ante terminum, the night hymn, drifted through the chapel, a soft, hopeful murmur asking God to protect the monk's sleep and the valley's peace. Its slow rhythm was deeply comforting. Alban reflected on the poetic metaphor of light, the candlelight in the chapel, the glow of Rue's lamps, and the light of knowledge he had rediscovered. All were protection against the darkness of ignorance and fear. He let the smooth wooden beads of his rosary slide between his fingers. The repetitive motion became a form of meditation, a gentle invitation to let go of the day. The monk felt the warmth of his own body and the coldness of the stone beneath him. He stood balanced between matter and spirit, darkness and light, ready for rest. A quiet contemplation settled over him. His life had purpose, and its reward was the valley's serenity. His final prayer was an act of gratitude and peace. He stood for the pax, the kiss of peace, a silent gesture of communion and forgiveness. The gentle touch of Brother Elias's hand was a sign of unity and harmony. Alban walked back to his cell, the sound of his footsteps softened by darkness and stillness. He was ready for sleep. He lay down on his cot, feeling the coarse straw beneath him. The clean linen and wool carried a comforting scent. He closed his eyes. The monk smiled softly. The peace of the valley was his rest, and he, at last, was at peace. In the silence before dawn, Alban felt both the weight of a long night's vigil and the lightness of a soul finally at rest. He lay on his cot in the cubiculum, sensing the familiar roughness of the straw beneath the woolen blanket. The feeling of peace was deep and absolute, a stark contrast to the tension that had haunted his sleep in the nights before. The scent of beeswax in his pocket, Ingrid's amulet, was the only fragrance breaking through the cold smell of stone, a subtle and poetic reminder of his journey. He focused on the abbey's sounds, the distant muffled whisper of wind sweeping down from the fjord, the soft breathing of the monks in neighboring cells, and the discreet crackle of an oil lamp in the corridor. All of it blended into a harmonious, ordered rhythm, the soundscape of monastic life that had finally triumphed over the chaos of the ancestral curse. It was a quiet symphony of serenity. The monk thought of Ingrid, the healer. He pictured her sleeping in her cabin, wrapped in a deep, untroubled rest, one no longer disturbed by the cries of lost souls. Her small human story, resting at last, was the culmination of his mission. Peace reached in the deepest silence of the night. He remembered the blue, ghostly lights that once danced over the marsh. Now, darkness was whole and clean, untouched by that cold, haunting glow. Their absence was the final sensory proof that the cycle of the betrayed's curse had been broken for good, a triumph made possible by cooperation. A historical curiosity drifted through his mind. In medieval life, nights were almost completely dark. The few candles and lamps inside homes and abbeys only emphasized the vast darkness beyond, an ever-present source of fear. Rue's work as a candle maker wasn't just practical, it was essential for psychological safety. Alban brushed his fingers over the mistletoe in his pocket, soft, velvety, warm. He pressed it gently, a gesture of connection and gratitude. In Ingrid's tradition, mistletoe symbolized life and protection. For Alban, it symbolized the truth he had found beyond the abbey walls. He focused on the cold air drifting in from the window. The chill was sharp, but his habit and blanket kept him warm. The contrast between the cold world and the warmth of his soul felt like a living metaphor for his faith. The monk rose from his cot and walked to the window. The light outside had shifted to a pale grey, the promise of dawn. He could see the faint outlines of mountains, silent and majestic, standing like ancient sentinels over a peaceful valley. He reflected on the poetic metaphor of farewell. Bjorn Olafsson, the warrior, had found his rest. His soul had sailed into peace, released from the pain of betrayal. The story was closed, and peace was its legacy. The first bell rang, the tower bell, announcing the beginning of Lord's and the sun's imminent arrival. Its deep, resonant sound was a call to gratitude and renewed light. He caught the sharp smell of pine smoke rising from the village of Hvelven. It was a sign of life, homes awakening, the community moving on without fear, serenity restored. A historical curiosity returned to him. In the Middle Ages, pilgrims traveled great distances seeking healing and redemption. His journey with Ingrid to the pagan temple had been, in its own way, a pilgrimage of healing, not for one person, but for the entire valley. The monk dressed and stepped into the corridor, feeling the cold stone beneath his feet. The light was brighter now, and he could hear other monks walking toward the chapel. He met Brother Elias, the gardener, headed the same way. Elias smiled, an honest smile of relief and peace, living proof that fear had lifted from the valley. A serene contemplation settled over Alban. His life was one of service, and its reward was the valley's restored calm. The absence of fear was the community's truest wealth. He thought again of Bjorn Olafsson. The warrior had been forgiven, his tragic story rewritten with a peaceful ending. Alban felt he had performed an act of spiritual charity. The chant of lauds began inside the chapel, a soft, hopeful chorus. Alban joined in, letting his voice merge with the others, a melody of gratitude and renewal. He focused on the way the rising sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting a gentle golden glow across the altar. Light itself was the symbol of redemption and hope. Another historical memory surfaced. Medieval scribes often ended their manuscripts with a colophon, a final note recording the title, the date, and sometimes a prayer or wish. Alban realized that his entry in the chronicle served as the colophon of the curse, the closing line that sealed peace into history. The sunlight touched his face through the glass, warm and welcome. The contrast with the cold stone reminded him of life's fragility and beauty. He thought of Ingrid, imagining her standing outside her cabin, feeling the same warmth, breathing in the scent of fresh herbs, at peace at last. A gentle contemplation surrounded him. The life of the abbey and the life of the valley were now in harmony. Faith and nature balanced. He allowed himself a quiet moment of gratitude for knowledge, for courage, and for the peace restored. When the chant ended, Prior Valerian offered the final blessing. Alban stood in his place, at peace, in service. The image that stayed with him was that of the sun rising over the valley of Hvelven, a light of redemption touching the mountains and the fjord. With the chanting of lauds now ended, Alban remained inside the chapel, feeling the warmth of the rising sun touch his face, a gentle warmth that carried the symbolism of redemption and new light. The scent of incense was fading, leaving behind a clean, fresh aroma that mingled with the cool smell of stone. His body felt tired, but his spirit felt light, wrapped in the final serenity that comes after work well done. He reflected on the quiet harmony between past and present. The past, filled with pain and the burden of Bjorn Olafsson's curse, had been heavy. The present, shaped by the union of the abbey's knowledge and Ingrid's earthly wisdom, was a time of peace and order. The story hadn't been forgotten. It had been resolved, and the valley was free from repeating its old wounds. The monk rose and walked toward the scriptorium. The sound of his steps on the stone floor was soft and discreet, a muted whisper of gratitude. He wasn't returning to isolation, but to the continuation of service, to the work that would preserve peace through the written word. He reached for the old chronicle, feeling the cool texture of the leather binding. He opened it to the page where he had recorded the end of the curse, his handwriting steady and permanent, the final seal upon the valley's story. There was a subtle echo of the tale's beginning here, the image of quill and parchment, now transformed into instruments of healing. Alban reflected on the poetic metaphor of farewell. The warrior Bjorn had departed on his final journey, unburdened at last. His soul had sailed into rest, and the valley had become his harbor of peace. The goodbye wasn't one of sorrow, but of acceptance and relief. The true climax of the story wasn't triumphant noise, it was profound stillness. Peace itself was the apex, the absence of fear, the triumph of order. Alban felt the warmth of sunlight spill through the window and onto the parchment, a message of peace written in light. He thought of Ingrid, the healer. He pictured her in her cabin, beginning her morning with the scent of fresh herbs and the quiet sounds of nature. Her wisdom, passed down orally, had been the key that unlocked a mystery no book alone could have solved. A historical curiosity drifted into his mind. In the Middle Ages, many monks maintained herb gardens and prepared medicines. Their work placed them side by side with local healers and the traditions of folk medicine, blending learned knowledge with practical wisdom. Alban brushed his fingers against the mistletoe in his pocket, Ingrid's amulet. He held it gently, feeling its velvety texture. It was the symbol of unity between the abbey's faith and the land's wisdom. The mistletoe had become his talisman of peace. He listened to the calm, steady beat of his own heart, the melody of a life at rest. He thought about the brevity of human existence and the permanence of the written word, the contrast between what fades and what endures. He sat at his desk. The familiar sense of iron gall ink and parchment welcomed him. He didn't immediately return to copying the homilies. Instead, he reached for a fresh quill and a scrap of parchment. The monk began to draw a small illustration, a visual memory of the night. He sketched a stone circle atop a hill, with a small flame rising toward the constellation of the Great Raven. Below it, he drew an open book and a sprig of mistletoe. A serene contemplation settled over him. His work as a scribe wasn't merely transcription. It was interpretation, preservation, and stewardship of truth, whether divine or ancestral. The abbey was the guardian of all stories. He reflected on the metaphor of light. The abbey's light, its knowledge, had dispelled the darkness of ignorance and fear. The sunlight outside was the light of peace. The abbey bell rang, marking the hour of prime and the official beginning of the workday. Its deep, resonant tone echoed the rhythm of order and faith. Alban felt the sun's warmth on his face, the warmth of redemption. He knew the valley of Velven was finally free, and his work had been the key to its liberation. He slipped the drawing into his breviary, a private, secret record of his journey. The story of the valley's freedom was now a part of him, carried in both his heart and his handwriting. The monk smiled softly. Serenity was complete. He was in his place, in peace, in service, ready for a new day. Until tomorrow. I'll be waiting to travel with you through these forgotten eras. You already know where to find me, right here between history and dream. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and rest well, traveler.